Here's James Henry Trotter when he was about 4 years old. Up until this time, he had a happy life, living peacefully with his mother and father in a beautiful house beside the sea. There were always plenty of other children for him to play with. There was the sandy beach for him to run about, and the ocean to paddle in. It was the perfect little life for a small boy. Then, one day, James's mother and father went to London to do some shopping, and there a terrible thing happened. Both of them suddenly got eaten up, in full daylight, mind you, and on a crowded street, by an enormous angry rhinoceros which had escaped from the London Zoo. Now this, as you can well imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents. But in the long run, it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were all over in a jiffy. They were dead and gone in 35 seconds flat. Poor James, on the other hand, was still very much alive. And all at once he found himself alone and frightened in a vast unfriendly world. The lovely house by the seaside had to be sold immediately, and the little boy, carrying nothing but a small suitcase containing a pair of pajamas and a toothbrush, was sent away to live with his two aunts. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and I am so sorry to say that they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning they started beating poor James for almost no reason at all. They never called him by his real name, but always referred to him as "you disgusting little beast," or "you filthy nonsense," or "you miserable creature." And they certainly never gave him any toys to play with or any picture books to look at. His room was as bare as a prison cell. They lived, Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and now James as well, in a queer ramshackle house on the top of a high hill in the south of England. The hill was so high that from almost anywhere in the garden James could look down and see for miles and miles across a marvelous landscape of woods and fields. And on a very clear day, if he looked in the right direction, he could see a tiny grey dot far away on the horizon, which was the house that he used to live in with his beloved mother and father. And just beyond that, he could see the ocean itself, a long thin streak of blackish blue, like a line of ink beneath the rim of the sky. But James was never allowed to go down off the top of that hill. Neither Aunt Sponge nor Aunt Spiker could ever be bothered to take him out herself, not even for a small walk or a picnic, and he certainly wasn't permitted to go alone. The nasty little beast would only get into mischief if he goes out of the garden, Aunt Spiker had said, and terrible punishment were promised him, such as being locked up in the cellar with the rats for a week, if he even so much as dared to climb over the fence. The garden, which covered the whole of the top of the hill, was large and desolate, and the only tree in the entire place, apart from a clump of dirty old lower bushes at the far end, was an ancient peach tree that never gave any peaches. There was no swing, no seesaw, no sandpit, and no other children were ever invited to come up the hill to play with poor James. There wasn't so much as a dog or a cat around to keep him company, and as time went on, he became sadder and more lonely, and he used to spend hours every day standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wistfully at the lonely but forbidden world of woods and fields and ocean that was spread out below him like a magic carpet. Here's James Henry Trotter, after he had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, which is when the story really begins. For now, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him, and this thing, which as I say was only rather peculiar, soon caused a second thing to happen, which was very peculiar, and then the very peculiar thing, in its own turn, caused a really fantastically peculiar thing to occur. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of summer. Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and James were all out in the garden. James had been put to work, as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in desk chairs nearby, sipping tall glasses of fizzy lemonade, and watching him to see that he didn't stop working for the moment. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small pinky eyes, a sunken mouth, and one of those white, flabby faces that looked exactly as though it had been boiled. She was like a great white sulky over boiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed onto the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice, a long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come shooting out of her mouth as she talked. And there sat their 2 ghastly hags, sipping their drinks, and every now and again screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought it was. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror on her lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own hideous face. "I look and smell," Aunt Sponge declared, "as lovely as a rose. Just feast your eyes upon my face, observe my shapely nose, behold my heavenly silky locks, and if I take off both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. But don't forget," Aunt Spiker cried, "how much your tummy shows. Aunt Sponge went red. Aunt Spiker said, "My sweet, you cannot win. Behold me, gorgeous, curvy shape, my teeth, my charming grin. Oh, beauteous me, how I adore my radiant looks, and please ignore the dimple on my chin. My dear old Trude," Aunt Sponge cried out, "you're only bones and skin. Such loveliness as I possess can only truly shine in Hollywood," Aunt Sponge declared. "Oh, I wouldn't that be fine? I'd capture all the nation's hearts. They give me all the leading parts. The stars would give all design. I think you make," Aunt Spiker said, "a lovely Frankenstein." Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arms was aching. The chopper was a large, blunt thing far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as she worked, Jane began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this moment. Some would be riding bicycle in their gardens, some would be walking in cool woods and picking bunches of wild flowers, and all the little friends whom he used to know would be down by the seaside, playing in the wet sand and splashing around the water. Great tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed by his own unhappiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast," Aunt Sponge ordered. "Oh, Auntie Sponge," James cried out, "and Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all please, just for once, go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far, and I feel so hot and awful and lonely." "Why, you lazy, good-for-nothing brute," Aunt Spiker shouted. "Beat him," cried Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will." Aunt Spiker shaped. They glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I shall beat you later on in the day when I don't feel so hot," she said. "And now get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and give me some peace." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden, and hid himself behind the clump of dirty old lower bushes that we mentioned earlier on. Then he covered his face with his hands and began to cry and cry. It was at this point that we first think of all, the rather peculiar thing that led to so many other much more peculiar things happened to him. For suddenly, just behind him, James heard a rustling of leaves, and he turned around and saw an old man in a crazy dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a very small old man, but he had a huge bald head and a face that was covered all over bristly black whiskers. He stopped when he was about 3 yards away, and he stood there leaning off his stick and staring hard at James. When he spoke, his voice was very slow and creaky. "Come closer to me, little boy," he said, beckoning to James with a finger. "Come right up close to me, and I will show you something wonderful." James was too frightened to move. The old man hobbled a step or two nearer, and then he put a hand into the pocket of his jacket and took out a small white paper bag. "You see this?" he whispered, waving the bag gently to and fro in front of James's face. "You know what this is, my dear? You know what's inside the little bag." Then he came nearer still, leaning forward and pushing his face so close to James's that James could feel breath blowing on his cheeks. The breath smelled musty and stale and slightly mildewed, like an air in an old cellar. "Take a look, my dear," he said, opening the bag and titling it toward James. Inside it, James could see a mess of tiny green things that looked like little stones or crystals, each one about the size of the grain of rice. They were extraordinarily beautiful, and there was a strange brightness about them, a sort of luminous quality that made them glow and sparkle in the most wonderful way. "Listen to them," the old man whispered. "Listen to them move." James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound coming up from inside it, and then he noticed all the thousands of little green things were slowly, very, very slowly, stirring about and moving over each other as thought they were alive. There is no more power and magic in those things in there than in all the rest of the world put together, the old man said softly. But what are they?" James murmured, finding his voice at last. "Where do they come from?" "Ha ha," the old man whispered. "You'd never guess that." He was crouching a little now and pushing his face still closer and closer to James until the tip of his long nose was actually touching the skin on James's forehead. Then suddenly he jumped back and began waving his stick madly in the air. "Crocodile tongues!" he cried. 1,000 long slimy crocodile tongues balled up in the skull of a dead which was 20 days and nights with the eyeballs of a lizard, at the fingers of a young monkey, the gizzard of a pig, the beak of a green parrot, the juice of a porcupine, and the 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew for another week, and then let the moon do the rest. All at once he pushed the white paper bag into James's hand and said, "Here, take it. It's yours." James Henry Trotter stood there, clutching the bag and staring at the old man. "And now," the man said, "all you've got to do is take a large jug of water and pour all the little green things into it. Then, very slowly, one by one, add 10 hairs from your own head. That sets them off. It gets them going. In a couple of minutes, the water will begin to froth and bubble furiously, and soon as that happens, you must quickly drink it all down, the whole jugful, in one gulp. And then, my dear, you will feel it crushing and boiling in your stomach, and steam will start coming out of your mouth. And immediately after that, marvelous things will start happening to you, fabulous, unbelievable things, and you will never be miserable again in your life. Because you are miserable, aren't you? You needn't tell me. I know all about it. Now, off you go and do exactly as I say, and don't whisper a word of this to those two horrible aunts of yours. Not a word. And don't tell them those green things in there get away from you either, because if they do escape, then they will be working their magic upon somebody else instead of upon you. And that isn't what you want at all. It is, my dear, wherever they meet first, being bug, insect, animal, or tree, that will be one who gets the full power of their magic. So hold the bed tight. Don't tear the paper. Off you go. Hurry up. Don't wait. Now's the time. Hurry. With that, the old man turned away and disappeared into the bushes. The next moment, James was riding back toward the house as fast as he could go. He would do it all in the kitchen, he told himself. If only he could get in there without Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker seeing him. He was terribly excited. He flew through the long grass and the stinging needles, not caring whether he got stung or not on his bare knees. And in the distance he could see Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker sitting in their chairs with their backs toward him. He swerved away from them so as to go around the other side of the house, but then suddenly, just as he was pacing underneath the old peach tree that stood in the middle of the garden, his foot slipped and he fell flat on his face in the grass. The paper bag burst open as it hit the ground, and thousands of tiny green things were scattered in all directions. James immediately picked himself up onto his hands and knees and started searching around for his precious treasures. But what was this? They were all sinking into the soil. He could actually see them wriggling and twisting as they burrowed their way downward into the hard earth, and at once he reached out a hand to pick some of them up before it was too late. But they disappeared right under his fingers. He went some others, and the same thing happened. He began scraping around in an effort to catch hold of those that were left, but they were too quick for him. Each time, the tips of his finger were just about to touch them. They vanished into the earth, and soon, in the space of only a few seconds, every single one of them had gone. James felt like crying. He would never get them back now. They were lost, lost, lost forever. But where had they gone to? And why in the world had they been so eager to push down into the earth like that? What were they after? There was nothing to down there, nothing except the roots of the old peach tree, and a whole lot of earthworms and centipedes and insects living in the soil. But was that if the old man had said wherever they met first, be it bug, insect, animal, or tree, that will be one who gets the full power of their magic? Good heavens, thought James, what is going to happen in that case if they do meet an earthworm, or a centipede, or a spider? And what if they do go into the roots of the peach tree? Get up at once, you lazy little beast, a voice was suddenly shouting in James's ear. James glanced up and saw Aunt Spiker standing over him, grim and tall and bunny, glaring at him through her steel-rimmed spectacles. Get back over there immediately and finish chopping up those logs, she ordered. Aunt Sponge, fat and pulpy as a jellyfish, came wadding up behind her sister to see what was going on. Why don't we just lower the body down the well in a bucket and leave him there for the night? She suggested. That ought to teach him not to laze around like this the whole day long. That's a very good whiz, my dear Sponge, but let's make him finish chopping up the woods first. Be off with you at once, you hideous brat, and do some work. Slowly, sadly, poor James got off the ground and went back to the woodpile. Oh, if only he hadn't slipped and fallen and dropped that precious bag. All hope of a happier life had gone completely now. Today and tomorrow and the next day, all the other days as well, would be nothing but punishment and pain, and happiness and despair. He picked up the chopper and was just about to start chopping away again when he heard a shout behind him that made him stop and turn. Sponge, Sponge, come here at once and look at this. Oh, what? It's a peach, Aunt Spiker was shouting. A what? A peach, right up there on the highest branch. Can you see it? I think you must be mistaken, my dear Spiker. That miserable tree never has any peaches on it. There's one on it now, Sponge. You look for yourself. You're teasing me, Spiker. You're making my mouth water on purpose when there's nothing to put into. Why, but the tree's never ever had a blossom on it, let alone a peach, right up on the highest branch, you say? I can't see a thing. Very funny. Ha ha. Good gracious me. Well, I'll be blowed. There really is peach up there. A nice big one too. Aunt Spiker said. A beauty, a beauty. Aunt Sponge cried out. At this point, James slowly put down his chopper and turned and looked across at the two women who were standing underneath the peach tree. Something is about to happen, he thought to himself. Something peculiar is about to happen any moment. He hadn't the faintest idea what it might be, but he could feel it in his bones that something was going to happen soon. He could feel it in the air around him. The sudden stillness that had fallen upon the garden. James tiptoed a little closer to the tree. The aunts were all talking now. They were just standing there, staring at the peach. There was not a round anywhere, not even a breath of wind, and overhead the sun blazed down upon them out of a deep blue sky. "It looks right to me," Aunt Spiker said, breaking the silence. "Then why don't we eat it?" Aunt Sponge suggested, licking her thick lips. "We can have half each. Here you, James, come over here at once and climb the tree." James came running over. "I want you to pick that peach up there on the highest branch," Aunt Sponge went on. "Can't you see it?" "Yes, Auntie Sponge, I can see it." "And don't you dare to eat any of it yourself. Your Aunt Spiker and I are going to have it between us, right here and now, half each. Get on with you. Up you go." James crossed over the tree trunk. "Stop," Aunt Spiker said quickly. "Hold everything." She was staring up into the branches with her mouth wide open and her eyes bulging as though they had seen a ghost. "Look," she said. "Look, Sponge, look." "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Sponge demanded. "It's growing," Aunt Spiker cried. "It's getting bigger and bigger." "What is?" "The peach, of course. You're joking. Well, look for yourself." "But my dear Spiker, that's perfectly ridiculous. That's impossible. That's... No, just wait a minute. No, that can't be right. No, yes, great Scott, the thing really is growing. It's nearly twice as big already," Aunt Spiker shouted. "It can't be true." "It is true. It must be a miracle. Watch it, watch it." "I am watching it." "Great heavens alive," Aunt Spiker yawned. "I can't actually see the thing bulging and swelling before my very eyes." The two women and the small boy stood absolutely still on the grass underneath the tree, gazing up at this extraordinary fruit. James's little face was glowing with excitement. His eyes were as big, as bright as two stars. He could see the peach swelling larger and larger, as clearly as if it were a balloon behind blow up. A half a minute, it was the size of a melon. In another half minute, it was twice as big again. "Just look it growing," Aunt Spiker cried. "Will it ever stop?" Aunt Sponge shouted, waving her fat arms and staring to dance around circles. And now it was so big it looked like an enormous butter-colored pumpkin dangling from the top of the tree. "Get away from the tree trunk, you stupid boy," Aunt Spiker yelled. "The slightest shake, and I'm sure it'd fall off. It must weigh 20 or 30 pounds at least." The branches that the peach was growing upon was beginning to bend over farther and farther because of the weight. "Stand back," Aunt Sponge shouted. "It's becoming down. The branch is going to break." But the branch didn't break. It simply bent over more and more, and the peach got heavier and heavier, and still it went on growing. In another minute, this mammoth fruit was as large and round and fat as Aunt Sponge herself, and probably just as heavy. "It has to stop now," Aunt Spiker yelled. "It can't go on forever." But it didn't stop. Soon it was the size of a small car and reached halfway to the ground. Both aunts were now hopping around and around the tree, clapping their hands and shouting all sorts of silly things in their excitement. "Yes," Hander Spiegel shouted, "what a peach! What a peach!" "Terrifico!" Aunt Sponge cried out. "Magnifico! And that was a meal. It is still growing." I know. And for James, he was so spellbound by the whole thing that he could only stand and stare and murmur quietly to herself, "Oh, it isn't beautiful. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Shut up, you little swerp," Aunt Spiker snapped, happening to overneath him. "It's none of your business." "That's right," Aunt Sponge declared. "It's got nothing to do with you whatsoever. Keep out of it." "Look," Aunt Spiker shouted, "it's growing faster than even now. It's bending up. I see it, Spiker. I do. Bigger and bigger grew the peach, bigger and bigger and bigger. Then at last, when it had become nearly as tall as the tree it was growing on, and tall and wide, in fact, as a small house, the bottom part of it gently touched the ground. And there it rested. "It can't fall off now," Aunt Sponge shouted. "It stopped growing," Aunt Spiker cried. "No, I hasn't." "Yes, it has. It's slowing down, Spiker. It's slowing down, but it hasn't stopped yet. You watch it." There was a pause. "It has now. I believe you're right. Do you think it's safe to touch it?" "I don't know. We'd better be careful." Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker began walking slowly around the peach, inspecting it very cautiously from all sides. They were like a couple of hunters who had just shot an elephant and were not quite sure whether it was dead or alive. The massive round fruit towered over them so high, and they looked midgets from other worlds beside it. The skin of the peach was very beautiful, a rich buttery yellow with patches of brilliant pink and red. Aunt Sponge advanced cautiously and touched it with the tip of one finger. "It's ripe," she cried. "It's just perfect. Now see here, Spiker, why don't you go and get us a shovel right away and dig out a great big hunk of it, you and me to eat?" "No," Aunt Spiker said. "Not yet." "Why ever not?" "Because I say so." "But I can't wait to eat some," Aunt Sponge cried out. She was watering on the mouth and eyes in a trickle of split was running down inside of her chin. "My dear Sponge," Aunt Spiker said slowly, winking at her sister and smiling a sly, thin-lipped smile. "There is a pile of money to be made out of this, if only we can handle it right. You wait and see." The news that a peach almost as big as a house had suddenly appeared in someone's garden spread like wildfire across the countryside, and the next day a stream of people came scrambling up the street high to gaze upon this marvel. Quickly, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker count carvedness and had them build a strong fence around the peach to save it from the crowd. And at the same time, there's 2 crafty women stationed themselves at the front gate with a large bunch of tickets and stared charging everyone for coming in. "Roll up, roll up," Aunt Spiker yelled, only one shining to see the coming peach. "Half price for children under 6 weeks old," Aunt Sponge shouted. "One at a time, please. Don't push, you're all going to get it. Hey you, come back there, you haven't paid." By lunchtime, the whole place was a seething mass of men, women, and children, all pushing and showing to get a glimpse of miraculous fruit. Helicopters were landing like warps over the hill, and out of them poured swarms of newspapers, reporters, cameramen, and men from the television companies. "It'll cost you double to bring in a camera," Aunt Spiker shouted. All right, they answered. "We don't care," and the money came rolling into the pockets of the 2 greedy aunts. But while all this excitement was going on outside, poor James was forced to stay locked in his bedroom, peeping through the bars of his window at the crowds below. The disgusting little brute will only get in everyone's way if you let him wander about, Aunt Spiker had said early that morning. "Oh, please," he had begged. "I haven't met any other children for years and years, and there are going to be lots of them down there for me to play with. And perhaps I could help you with the tickets." "Cut it out," Aunt Sponge had snapped. "Your Aunt Spiker and I are about to become millionaires, and the last thing we want is the likes of you messing things up and getting in the way." Later, when the evening of the first day came and the people had all gone home, the aunts unlocked James's door and ordered him to go outside and pick up all the banana skins and orange peel and bits of paper the crowd had left behind. "Could I please have something to eat first?" he asked. "I haven't had a thing all day." "No," they shouted, kicking him out of the door. "We are too busy to make food. We are counting our money." "But it's dark," cried James. "Get out," they yelled, "and stay out until you've cleaned up all the mess." The door slammed. The key turned in the lock. Hungry and trembling, James stood alone out of the open, wondering what to do. The night was all around him now, and high overhead a wild white moon was riding in the sky. There was not a sound, not a movement anywhere. Most people, and especially small children, are often quite scared of being out of doors alone in the moonlight. Everything is so deadly quiet, and the shadows are so long and black, and they keep turning into strange shapes that seem to move as you look at them, and the slightest little snap of a twig makes you jump. James exactly felt like that now. He stared straight ahead with large frightened eyes, hardly daring to breathe. Not far away, in the middle of the garden, he could see the giant peach towering over everything else. Surely it was even bigger tonight than ever before. And what a dazzling sight it was! The moonlight was shining and glinting on its great curving sides, turning them to crystal and silver. It looked like a tremendous silver ball lying there in the grass, silent, mysterious, and wonderful. And then all at once, little shivers of excitement started running over the skin of James's back. Something else, he told himself. Something stranger rather than this time. It's about to happen to me again soon. He was sure of it. He was feel it coming. He looked around him, wondering what on earth it was going to be. The garden was soft and silver in the moonlight. The grass was wet with dew, and a million dewdrops were sparkling and twinkling like diamonds around his feet. And now, suddenly, the whole place, the whole garden, seemed to be alive with magic. Almost without knowing what he was doing, as though drawn by some powerful magnet, James Henry Trotter started walking slowly towards the giant peach. He climbed over the fence that surrounded it and stood directly beneath it, staring up at its great, bulging sides. He put out a hand and touched it gently with the tip of the finger. It felt soft and warm and slightly furry, like the skin of a baby mouse. He moved a step closer and rubbed his cheek lightly against the soft skin. And then suddenly, while he was going and doing this, he happened to notice that right beside him and below him, close to the ground, there was a hole in the side of the peach. It's quite a large hole, the sort of thing an animal about the size of a fox might have made. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders inside. He crawled on. He kept on crawling. This isn't just a hole, he thought excitedly. It's a tunnel. The tunnel was damp and murky, and all around him there was crucious, bittersweet smell of fresh peach. The floor was soggy under his knees, the walls was wet and sticky, and peach juice was dripping from the ceiling. James opened his mouth and got some of it on his tongue. It tasted delicious. He was crawling uphill now, as though the tunnel were leading straight towards the very center of the gigantic fruit. Every few seconds he paused and took a bite out of the wall. The peach flesh was sweet and juicy and marvelously refreshing. He crawled on for several more yards, and then suddenly, bang, the top of his head bumped into something extremely hard blocking his way. He glanced up. In front of him there was a solid wall that seemed at first as though it were made of wood. He touched it with his fingers. It certainly felt like wood, except it was very jagged and full of deep grooves. "God heavens," he said. "I know that it is. I've come to see the stone in the middle of the pitch." Then he noticed that there was a small door cut into the face of the peach stone. He gave a push. It swung open. He crawled through it, and before he had time to glance up and see where he was, he heard a voice saying, "Look who's here," and another one said, "We've been waiting for you." James stood and stared at the speakers, his face white with horror. He started to stand up, but his knees were shaking so much he had sat down again on the floor. He glanced behind him, thinking he could bolt back into the tunnel the way he had come, but the doorway was disappeared. There was only a solid brown wall behind him. James's large, frightened eyes traveled slowly around the room. The creatures, some sitting on chairs, others wriggling on the sofa, were all watching him intently. Creatures? Or were they insects? An insect is usually something rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So what would it call if it was you, a grasshopper as large as a dog, as large as a large dog? You could hardly call that an insect, could you? There was an old green grasshopper as large as a large dog sitting on a stool directly across the room from that James now. And next to the old green grasshopper there was an enormous spider, and next to the spider there was a giant ladybug with 9 black spots on her scarlet shell. Each of these 3 was squatting aboard a magnificent chair. On a sofa nearby, reclining comfortably in curled up positions, there was a centipede and an earthworm. On the floor over in the far corner, there was something thick and white and looked as though it might be a silkworm, but it was sleeping soundly and nobody was paying any attention on it. Every one of these creatures was at least as big as James himself, and in the strange greenish light that shone down from somewhere in the ceiling, they were absolutely terrifying to behold. "I'm hungry," the spider announced suddenly, staring hard at James. "I'm famished," the old green grasshopper said. So am I, the ladybug cried. The centipede sat up a little stranger on the sofa. Everyone's famished, he said. We need food. For pairs of round, black, glassy eyes were all fixed upon James. The centipede made a wriggling movement with his body as though he were about to glide off the sofa, but he didn't. There was a long pause and a long silence. The spider, who happened to be a female spider, opened her mouth and ran a long black tongue delicately over her lips. Aren't you hungry? She asked suddenly, leaning forward and addressing herself to James. Poor James was backed up against the far wall, shivering with fright, arid, much too terrified to answer. What's the matter with you? The old green grasshopper asked. You look positively ill. He looks as though he is going to faint any second, the centipede said. Oh my goodness, the poor thing, the ladybug cried. I do believe he thinks it's him that we are all wanting to eat. There was a roar of laughter from all sides. Oh dear, they said. What an awful thought. You mustn't be frightened, the ladybug said kindly. We wouldn't dream of hurting you. You are one of us now. Didn't you know that? You are one of the crew. We're all in the same boat. We've been waiting for you all day long, the old green grasshopper said. We thought you were never going to turn up. I'm glad you made it. So cheer up, my boy, cheer up, the centipede said. And meanwhile, I wish you'd come over here and give me a hand with these boots. It takes me hours to get them all of myself. James decided that this was most certainly not a time to be disagreeable, so he crossed the room to where the centipede was sitting and knelt down beside him. Thank you so much, the centipede said. You are very kind. You have lots of boots, James murmured. I have lots of legs, the centipede answered proudly, and a lot of feet. 100 to be exact. There he goes again, the earthworm cried, speaking for the first time. He simply cannot stop telling lies about his legs. He doesn't have anything like 100 of them. He's only got 42. The trouble is that the most people don't bother to count them. They just like his word. And anyway, there is nothing marvelous, centipede, about having a lot of legs. Poor fellow, the centipede said, whispering in James' ear. He is blind. He can't see how splendid I look. In my opinion, the earthworm said, the really marvelous thing is to have no legs at all and be able to walk just the same. You call that walking? Cried Centipede. You are a slitherer. That's all you are. You just slither along. I glide, said the earthworm primly. You are a slimy beast, answered the centipede. I'm not a slimy beast, the earthworm said. I'm a useful, as much-loved creature. Ask any gardener you like. And as for you, I'm a pest. the centipede announcement, grinning broadly and looking round the room for approval. "You're so proud of that," the ladybug said, smiling, and James thought, for the life of me, I cannot understand why. "I'm the only pest in his room," cried the centipede, still grinning away, "unless you count old green grasshopper over there, but he is long past, and now he is too old to be a pest any more." The old green grasshopper turned his huge black eyes upon the centipede and gave him a withering look. "Young fellow," he said, speaking in a deep, slow, groanful voice, "I've never been a pest in my life. I am a musician." "Hear, hear," said the ladybug. "James," the centipede said, "your name is James, isn't it?" "Yes." "Well, James, have you ever in your life seen such a marvelous, colossal centipede as me?" "I certainly haven't," James answered. "How on earth did you get to be like that?" "Very peculiar," the centipede said. "Very, very peculiar indeed. Let me tell you what happened. I was messing about in the garden until the old peach tree, and suddenly a funny little green thing came wriggling past my nose. Bright green it was, and extraordinarily beautiful, and it looked like some kind of tiny stone or crystal." "Oh, but I know what was that," cried James. "It happened to me too," said the ladybug. "And me," Miss Spider said. "Suddenly there were little green things everywhere. The soil was full of them. I actually swallowed one," the earthworm declared proudly. "So did I," the ladybug said. "I swallowed 3, the centipedes cried. "But who's telling this story anyway? Don't interrupt. It's too late to tell stories now," the old green grasshopper announced. "It's time to go to sleep." "I refuse to sleep in my boots," the centipede cried. "How many more are there to come off, James?" "I think I've done about 20 so far," James told him. "Then that leaves 80 to go," the centipede said. 22, not 80, shrieked the earthworm. "He's slain again," the centipede roared with laughter. "Stop pulling the earthworm leg," the ladybug said. This sent the centipede into hysterics. "Pulling his legs," he cried, wriggling with glee and pointing at the earthworm. "Which leg am I pulling? You tell me that." James decided he'd rather like the centipede. He was obviously a rascal, but a change it was not to hear somebody laughing once in a while. He had never had an Aunt Sponge or Aunt Spiker laughing around in all the time he had been with them. "We really must get some sleep," the old green grasshopper said. "We've got a tough day ahead of us tomorrow, so would you be so kind enough, Miss Spider, to make the beds?" A few minutes later, Miss Spider had made the first bed. It was hanging from the ceiling, suspended by a rope of threads at either end, so that actually it looked more like a hammock than a bed. But it was a magnificent affair, and the stuff it was made of shimmered like silk in the pale light, and soft and silky as I possibly could, I spun up with gossamer. That's a much better quality thread than one I use for my own web. Thank you so much, my dear lady, the old green grasshopper said, climbing into the hammock. Ah, and it's just what I needed. Good night, everybody. Good night. Then Miss Spider spun the next hammock and the ladybug got in. After that, she spun a long one of the centipede and an even longer of one of the earthworm. And how do you like your bed? She said to James when it came to his turn. Hard or soft? I like it soft. Thank you so much, James answered. For goodness sake, stop staring around the room and get on with my boots, the centipede said, and you are never going to get any sleep at any rate, and kindly line them up neatly in pairs as you take of them. Don't just throw them over your shoulder. James worked away fantastically of the centipede's boots. Each one has laces that had to be untied and loosened before it could be pulled off. And to make matters worse, all the laces were tied up in the most terrible complicated knots that had to be unpacked with fingernails. It was just awful. It took about 2 hours, and by the time James had pulled off the last boot of all, and I had lined them up in a row on the floor, 21 pairs altogether, the centipede was fast asleep. Wake up, centipede, whispered James, giving him a gentle dig in the stomach. It's time for bed. Thank you, my dear child, the centipede said, opening his eyes. Then he got down off the sofa and ambled across the room and crawled into his hammock. James got into his own hammock. And oh, how soft and comfortable it was compared with the hard bare boots on his aunts had always made him sleep upon at home. Lights out, said the centipede drowsily. Nothing happened. Turn out the light, he called, raising his voice. James glanced around the room, wondering which of the others he might be talking to, but they were all asleep. The old green grasshopper was snoring loudly through his nose. The ladybug was making whistling noises as she breathed, and the earthworm was coiled up like a spring at one end of his mammoth, wheezing and blowing through his open mouth. As for Miss Spider, she had made a lovely web for herself across one corner of the room, and James could see her crouching right in the very center of it, mumbling softly in her dreams. I said turn out the light, shouted the centipede angrily. Are you talking to me? James asked him. Of course, I'm not talking to you, you ass, the centipede answered. The crazy glowworm has gone to sleep with her light on. For the first time since entering the room, James glanced up at the ceiling, and there he saw a most extraordinary sight. Something that looked like a gigantic flower without wings, it was at least 3 feet long, was standing upside down upon his legs, and the middle of the ceiling and the tail end of this creature seemed to be literally of fire, a brilliant greenish light, and bright as the brightest electric bulb, was shining out its tail and lighting up the whole room. "Is that a glowworm?" asked James, starting at the light. "It doesn't look like a worm of any sort to mine." "Of course it's a glowworm," the centipede answered. "At least that she calls herself, although actually you're quite right. She isn't really a worm at all. Glowworms are never worms. They're simply lady fireflies without wings. Wake up, you lazy beast." But the glowworm didn't stir, so the centipede reached out of his hammock and picked up one of his boots from the floor. "Pull out the rich light," he shouted, holding the boot up at the ceilings. The glowworm slowly opened one eye and stared at the centipede. "There's no need to be rude," said coldly. "All good time. Come on, come on, come on," shouted the centipede, "or I'll put it out for you." "Oh, hello, James," the glowworm said. "I'm looking down and giving James a little wave and a smile. I didn't see you coming. Welcome, my dear boy, welcome, and good night." And click, and out went the light. James Henry Trotter lay there in the darkness with his eyes wide open, listening to the strange sleeping noises that the creatures were making all around him, and wondering what on earth was going to happen to him in the morning. Already he was beginning to like his new friends very much. They were not nearly as terrible as they looked. In fact, they weren't really terrible at all. They seemed extremely kind and helpful in spite of all the shouting and arguing that went on between them. "Good night, old green grasshopper," he whispered. "Good night, ladybug. Good night, Miss Spider." But before he could go through them all, he had fallen fast asleep. "We're off!" someone shouting. "We're off at last!" James woke up with a jump and looked about him. The creatures were all about over their hammocks and moving excitedly around the room. Suddenly the floor gave a great heave, as though an earthquake were taking place. "Here we go!" shouted the old green grasshopper, hopping up and down with excitement. "Hold on tight!" "What's happening?" cried James, leaping out of his hammock. "What's going on?" The ladybug, who was obviously a kind and gentle creature, came over and stood beside him. "In case you don't know it," she said, "we're all about to depart forever from the top of his ghastly hill that we've been living or for so long. We are about to roll away inside the great big beautiful beach to a land of what?" asked James. "Never you mind," said the ladybug. "But nothing could be worse than this desolate hilltop and those two repulsive aunts of yours." "Here, here!" they all shouted. "Here, here!" "You may not to have noticed it," the ladybug went on, "but the whole garden, even before it reaches the steep edge of the hill, happens to be on a steep slope, and therefore the only thing that has been stopping this beach from rolling away right from the beginning is the thick steam attaching into the tree. Break the steam, and off we go." "Watch it!" cried Miss Spider, and the room gave another violent lunge. Here we go. Not quite, not quite. At this moment, continued the ladybug, our centipede, who has a pair of jaws and sharp as razors, is up there on the top of the beach nibbling away at that steam. In fact, he must be nearly through it, as you can tell from the way we've launching about. Would you like to take me under my wings so that you won't fall over where we start rolling? That's very kind of you, said James, but I think I'll be right. Just then the centipede stuck his grinning face through the hole in the ceiling and shouted, "I've done!" "We're off! We're off!" the others cried. "We're off, and the journey begins!" shouted the centipede. And who knows the right wind and muttered the earthworm, if you have anything to do it can only mean trouble. "Nonsense," said the ladybug. "We are now about to visit the most marvelous places and see the most wonderful things." "Isn't that so, centipede?" "There is no knowing that we shall see," cried the centipede. "We may see a creature with 39 heads who lives in the desolate snow, and whenever he catches a cold, which he dreads, he has 49 noses to blow. We may see the venomous pink spotter scrunch, who can chew up a man with one bite. It likes to eat 5 of them roasted for lunch, and 18 for its supper at night. We may see a dragon, and nobody knows that we won't see a unicorn there. We may see a terrible monster with toes growing out of tufts of his hair. We may see the sweet little beady bright hen, so playful, so kind, and well-bred, and such beautiful eggs. You just boil them, and then they explode, and they blow off your head. A gnu and a rhinoceros softly you'll see, and an enormous and ignorable gnat, whose sting when it stings you goes it in the knee, and comes out through the top of your head. We may even get lost and be frozen by frost. We may die in an earthquake or tremor, or nastier still, we may even be toast on the horns of a furious dilemma. But who cares? Let us go from his horrible hill. Let us roll, let us bow, let us plunk. Let's go rolling and bowling and spinning until we are away from old Spiker and Sponge. 1 second later, slowly, insidiously, almost gently, the great beach started to lean forward and steal into motion. The whole room began to tilt over, and all the furniture went sliding across the floor and crashed against the far wall. So did James and the ladybug and the old green grasshopper and Miss Spider and the earthworm, also the centipede who had just come slithering quickly down the wall. Outside in the garden, at that very moment, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker had just taken their places at the front gate, each with a bunch of tickets in her hand, and the first stream of early morning sadness was visible in the distance climbing up the hill to view the pitch. "We shall make a fortune today," Aunt Spiker was saying. "Just look at all those people. I wonder what became of that horrid little boy of ours last night," Aunt Sponge said. He never did come back in, did he? He probably fell down in the dark and broke his leg, Aunt Spiker said. Or his neck, maybe, Aunt Sponge said hopefully. Just wait till I'll get my hands on him, Aunt Spiker said, waving her cane. He'll never want to stay out at night again by the time I've finished with him. Good gracious me, what's that awful noise? Both women swung around to look. The noise, of course, had been caused by the giant peach crashing through the fence that surrounded it. And now, gathering speed every second, it came rolling across the garden toward the place where Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were standing. They gaped, they screamed, they started to run, they panicked, they both got in each other's way. They began pushing and jostling, and each other of them was thinking only about saving herself. Aunt Sponge, the fat one, tripped over a box that she'd brought along to keep the money in and fell flat on her face. Aunt Spiker immediately tripped over Aunt Sponge and came down on top of her. They both lay on the ground, fighting and clawing and yelling and struggling frantically to get up again. But before they could do this, the mighty peach was upon them. There was a crunch, and then there was silence. The peach rolled on, and behind it, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker lay ironed out upon the grass, as flat and thin and lifeless as a couple of paper dolls cut out of a picture book. And now the peach had broken out of the garden and was over the edge of the hill, rolling and bouncing down the steep slope at a terrific pace. Faster and faster and faster it went, and the crowds of people who were climbing up to the hill suddenly caught sight of this terrible monster plunging down upon them, and they screamed and scattered to right and left as it went halting by. At the bottom of the hill, it charged across the road, knocking over a telegraph pole and fluttering two parked automobiles as it went by. Then it rushed madly across about 20 fields, breaking down all the fences and hedges in its path. It went right through the middle of a herd of fine Jersey cows, and then through a flock of sheep, and then through a paddock full of horses, and then through a yard full of pigs, and soon the whole countryside was a seething mass of panic-stricken animals, stampeding in all directions. The peach was still going at a tremendous speed, with no sign of slowing down, and about a mile farther on it came to a village. Down the main street of the village it rolled, with people leaping frantically out of its path right and left, and at the end of the street it went crashing right through the wall of an enormous building and out of the other side, leaving two gaping round holes in the brickwork. This building happened to be a famous factory where they made chocolate, and almost at once a great river of warm melted chocolate came pouring out of the holes in factory wall. A minute later, this brown sticky mass was flowing through every street in the village, oozing onto the doors of houses and into people's shops and gardens. Children were wading in it up onto their knees, and some were even trying to swim in it, and all of them were sucking it into their mouth in great greedy gulps and shrieking with joy. But the peach rushed on across the countryside, and on and on and on, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Stables, pixies, barns, bungalows, hayricks, anything that got in its way went toppling over like a ninepin. An old man sitting quietly beside a stream had his fishing rod whisked out of his hands, and it went dashing by, and a woman called Daisy Antwist was standing so close to it fast that she had the skin taken off the tip of her long nose. Would you ever stop? Why should it? A round object will always keep on rolling as long as it on a down will stop. And this is the case. The land stalled down will and the way until it reached the ocean, the same ocean that James had begged his aunts to be allowed to visit the day before. Well, perhaps he was going to visit it now. The peach was rushing closer and closer to it every second, and closer, and also to the towering white cliffs that came first. These cliffs are the most famous in the whole of England, and they are hundreds of feet high. Below them, the sea is deep and cold and hungry. Many ships have been swallowed up and lost forever on this part of the coast, and all the men who were in them as well. The beach was only 100 yards away from the cliff. Now 50, now 20, now 10, now 5, and then it reached the edge of the cliff. It seemed to leap up into the sky and hung there suspended for a few seconds, still turning over and over in the air. Then it began to fall, down, 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 smack! It hit the water with a colossal splash and sank like a stone. But a few seconds later, up it came again, and this time up it stayed, floating serenely upon the surface of the water. At this moment, the scene inside the beach itself was one of incredible chaos. James Henry Trotter was lying bruised and battered on the floor of the room amongst a tangled mess of centipede and earthworm and spider and ladybug and glowworm and old green grasshopper. In the whole history of the world, no travelers had ever had a more terrible journey than these unfortunate creatures. It had started out well, with much laughing and shouting, and for the first few seconds, as the peach had begun to roll slowly forward, nobody had minded being tumbled out a little bit. And then it went bump, and the centipede had shouted, "That was Aunt Sponge," and then bump again, and that was Aunt Spiker. There had been a tremendous burst of cheering all around. But as soon as the peach rolled out of the garden and began to go down the step hill, rushing and plunging and bounding madly downward, and the whole thing became a nightmare. James found himself being flung up against the ceiling, then back onto the floor, then sideways against the wall, then up onto the ceiling again, and up, down, and back, and forth, and round, and at the same time the other creatures were flying through the air in every direction, and so were the chairs and the sofa, not to mention the 42 boots belonging to the centipede. Everything and all of them were being rattled around like peas inside an enormous rattle that was being rattled by a mad giant who refused to stop. To make it worse, something went wrong with the glowworm's lightning system, and the room was in pitchy darkness. There were screams and yells and curses and cries of pain, and everything came going round and round. At once James made a frantic grab at some thick bars sticking out from the wall, only to find that there were a couple of the centipede's legs. "Let go, you idiot!" shouted the centipede, nicking himself free, and James was promptly flung across the room into the old green grasshopper's horny lap. Twice he got tangled up Miss Spider's leg. A horrid business. And toward the end, the poor earthworm, who was cracking himself like a whip every time he flew through the air from one side of the room to the other, coiled himself around James's body in a panic and refused to unwing. Oh, it was a frantic and terrible trip, but it was all over now, and the room was suddenly very still and quiet. Everybody was beginning slowly and painfully to disentangle himself from everybody else. "Let's have some light," shouted the centipede. "Yes," cried, "light, give us more light." "I'm trying," answered the poor glowworm. "I'm doing my best. Please, be patient." They all waited in silence. Then a faint greenish light began to glimmer out of the glowworm's tail, and this gradually became stronger and stronger until it was anyway enough to see by. "Some great journey," the centipede said, limping across the room. "I shall never be the same again," murmured the earthworm. "Nor I," the ladybug said. "It's taken years of my life, but my dear friends," cried the old green grasshopper, trying to be cheerful, "we are there." "Where?" they asked. Where is there?" "I don't know," the old green grasshopper said, "but I bet it's somewhere good. We are probably at the bottom of a coal mine," the earthworm said gloomily. "We suddenly went down and down and down, very suddenly, at the last moment. I felt it in my stomach. I still feel it. Perhaps we are in the middle of a beautiful country full of songs and music," the old green grasshopper said. "Or near the seashore," said James eagerly, with lots of other children's down on the sand for them to play with. "Pardon me," murmured the ladybug, turning a trifle pale, "but I'm wrong. I'm thinking that we seem to be bobbing up and down." "Bobbing up and down," they cried. "What on earth do you mean?" "You're still giddy from the journey," the old green grasshopper told her. "You'll get over it in a minute. Everybody ready to go upstairs? Now and take a look round." Yes, yes, they chorused. Come on, let's go. I refuse to show myself out of doors in my bare feet, the centipede said. I have to get my boots on again first. For heaven's sake, let's not go through all that nonsense again, the earthworm said. Let's all lend the centipede a hand and get it over with, the ladybug said. Come on. So they did, and except Miss Spider, who set about weaving a long rope ladder that would reach from the floor up to a hole in the ceiling, the old green grasshopper had wisely said that they must not risk going out of the side entrance when they didn't know where they were, but must first of all to go onto the top of the path and have a look around. So half another hour, when the rope ladder had been finished and hung, and the 30-second boot had been laced neatly onto the centipede's 32nd foot, they were all ready to go out. Amidst mounting excitement and shouts of "Here we go, boys! The promised land! I can't wait to see it!" The whole company climbed up the ladder one by one and disappeared into a dark, soggy tunnel in the ceiling that went steeply, almost vertically, upward. A minute later, they were out in the open, standing on the very top of the beach, near steam, blinking their eyes in the strong sunlight and peering nervously around. What happened? Where are we? But it is impossible, unbelievable, terrible. I told you we're bobbing up and down, the ladybug said. We are in the middle of the sea, cried James. And indeed they were. A strong current and a high wind had carried the beach so quickly away from the shore that already the land was out of sight. All normal around them lay the vast black ocean, deep and hungry. Little waves were bibbling against the sides of the beach. But how did it happen? They cried. Where are the fields? Where are the woods? Where is the England? Nobody, not even James, could understand how in the world a thing like this could have come about. Ladies and gentlemen, the old green grasshopper said, trying very hard to keep the fear and disappointment out of his voice. I'm afraid that we find ourselves in a rather awkward situation. Awkward, cried the earthworm. My dear old grasshopper, we are finished. Every one of us is about to perish. I might be blind, you know, but that much I can see quite clearly. Off with my boots, shouted the centipede. I cannot swim with my boots on. I can't swim at all, cried the ladybug. Nor can I, wailed the glowworm. Nor I, said Miss Spider. None of us, 3 girls, can swim a single stroke. But you won't have to swim, said James calmly. We are floating beautifully, and sooner or later a ship is bound to come along and pick us up. They all stared at him in amazement. Are you quite sure that we are not sinking? The ladybug asked. Of course I'm sure, answered James. Go and look for yourselves. They all ran over to the side of the beach and peered down at the water below. "The boy is quite right," the old green grasshopper said. "We are floating beautifully. Now we must all sit down and keep perfectly calm. Everything will be all right in the end." "What absolute nonsense!" cried the earthworm. "Nothing is ever all right in the end, and well, you know it." "Poor earthworm," the ladybug said, whispering in James's ear. "He loves to make everything into a disaster. He hates to be happy. He is only happy when he is gloomy. Now isn't that odd? But then, I suppose, just being an earthworm is enough to make a person pretty gloomy. Don't you agree?" "If this speech is not going to sink," the earthworm was saying, "and if we are not going to be drowned, then every one of us is going to strafe to death instead. Do you realize that we haven't had a thing to eat since yesterday morning?" "By golly, he's right," cried the centipede. "For once, earthworm is right." "But of course I'm right," the earthworm said. "And we are not likely to find anything around there either. We shall get thinner and thinner and thirstier and thirstier, and we shall all die a slow and ghastly death from starvation. I'm dying already. I'm slowly shriveling up for want of food. Personally, I would rather drown." "But good heavens, you must be blind," said James. "You know very well I'm blind," snapped the earthworm. "There is no need to rub in it." "I didn't mean that," said James quickly. "I'm sorry, but can't you see that?" "See?" shouted the poor earthworm. "How can I see if I'm blind?" James took a deep, slow breath. "Can't you realize," he said patiently, "that we have enough food here to last us for weeks and weeks?" "Where?" they said. "Where?" "Why, the beach, of course. Our whole ship is made of food." Jumping, they cried, "We never thought of that." "My dear James," said the old green grasshopper, laying a front leg affectionately on James's shoulder, "I don't know what we'd do without you. You're so clever. Ladies and gentlemen, we are saved again." "We are almost certainly not," said the earthworm. "You must be crazy. You can't eat the sheep. It's the only thing that is keeping us up. We shall starve if we don't," said the centipede. "And we shall drown if we do," cried the earthworm. Oh dear," said the old green grasshopper. "Now we are worse off than before." "Couldn't we just eat a little bit?" asked Miss Spider. "I'm so dreadfully hungry." "You can't eat all you want," James answered. "You would take us weeks and weeks to make any sort of dent in this enormous beach. Surely you can't see that?" "Good heavens, he's right again," cried the old green grasshopper, clapping his hands. "It would take weeks and weeks. Of course it would. But let's not go making a lot of holes all over the deck. I think we'd better simply scoop it out of that tunnel over there, the one that we've just come up by." "An excellent idea," said the ladybug. "What are you looking so worried about, Earthworm?" the centipede asked. "What's the problem?" "The problem is," the Earthworm said, "the problem is that there is no problem." Everyone burst out laughing. "Cheer up, Earthworm," they said. "Come and eat." And they all went to over the tunnel entrance and began scooping out great chunks of juicy, golden-colored peach flesh. "Oh, marvelous," said the centipede, stuffing it into his mouth. "Delicious," said the old green grasshopper. "Just fabulous," said the grown worm. "Oh my," said the ladybug primly. "What a heavenly taste!" She looked up at James, and she smiled, and James smiled back at her. They sat down on a desk together, both of them chewing away happily. "You know, James," the ladybug said, "up until this moment I have never in my life tasted anything except those tiny little green flies that live on rose bushes. They have a perfectly delightful flavor, but this peach is even better." "Isn't it glorious?" Miss Spider said, coming over to join them. "Personally, I had always thought that a big, juicy, caught-in-the-web blue bottle was the funniest dinner in the world until I tasted this." "What a flavor!" the centipede cried. "It's terrific. There is nothing like it. There's never has been. And I should know because I personally have tasted all the funniest foods in the world." Whereupon the centipede, with his mouth full of peach and with juice running down all over his chin, suddenly burst into song. "I've been eating many strange and scrumptious dishes in my life, like Gilead Jans and Dandrucky and earwigs cooked in slime, and meats with rice. They're really nice when roasted in their prime, but I don't forget to sprinkle them with just a pinch of grime. I've eaten fresh mud burgers by the greatest cooks there are, and scrambled dregs and sting-bug eggs and orange stewed in tar, and pails of snails and lizard tails and beetles by the jar, and beetle is improved by just a splash of vinegar. I often eat boiled slopbacks. They're grand when served beside minced doddlebugs and carrot slugs. And have you ever tried mosquito stoves and bumpship roes? Most delicately fried. The only trouble is they disagree with my inside. I am made of crispy wasp things, of piece of buttered toast, and picked spines of porcupines, and then a gorgeous roast of dragon's flesh, well hung, no fresh. It costs $1 at most, and comes to you in barrels if you order it my toast. I crave the tasty technicals of Octopi for tea. I like hot dogs, I love hot dogs, and surely you'll agree. A pail of soil with engine oils, a super recipe. I hardly need to mention that it's practically free for dinner on my birthday. Shall I tell you what I chose? Hot noodles made from puddles in a slice of garden hose, and a rather smelly jelly made of armadillo toes. The jelly is delicious, but you have not to hold your nose. Now comes, the centipede declared, the burden of my speech. These foods are rare beyond compare. Some are right out of reach. But there is no doubt I'd go without a million plates of each for one small mite, one tiny bite of this fantastic peach. Everybody was feeling happy now. The sun was shining brightly out of soft blue sky, and there was calm. The giant peach, with the sunlight glinting on this side, was like a massive golden ball sailing upon a silver sea. "Look!" cried the centipede, just as they were finishing their meal. "Look at that funny thin black thing gliding through the water over there." They all swung around to look. "There are lots of them," said the ladybug. "What are they?" asked the earthworm, getting worried. "It must be some kind of fish," said the old green grasshopper. "Perhaps they have come along to say hello." "They are sharks!" cried the earthworm. "I'll bet you anything you like that they are sharks, and they have come along to eat us up." "What absolute rot!" the centipede said, but his voice seemed suddenly to have become a little shaky, and he wasn't laughing. "I'm positive they are sharks," said the earthworm. "Just know that they are sharks." And so, in actual fact, did everybody else. But they were too frightened to admit it. There was a sort of silence. The earth peered down anxiously, and the sharks who were cruising slowly round and round the beach. "Just assuming they are sharks," the centipede said, "there still can't possibly be any danger if we stay up there." "Just assuming." But as he spoke, one of those thin black fins suddenly changed direction and came cutting swiftly through the water right up to sight of the beach itself. The shark paused and stared up at the company with small evil eyes. "Go away!" they shouted. "Go away, you filthy beast!" Slowly, almost lazily, the shark opened his mouth, which was too big enough to have swallowed a perambulator, and made a lung at the beach. They all watched, and now, as though as a signal from the latter, all the other sharks came swimming in toward the beach, and they coasted round, and they began to attack it furiously. There must have been 20 or 30 of them at least, all pushing and fighting and lashing their tails and crunching the water into a froth. Panic and pandemonium broke out immediately on top of the beach. "Oh, we are finished now," cried Miss Spider, wringing her feet. "They will eat us up, whole beach, and there'll be nothing left for us to stand on, and they'll start on us." "She is right," shouted the ladybug. "We are lost forever." "Oh, I don't want to be eaten," wailed the earthworm, "but they will make me first of all, because I am so fat and juicy and have no bones." "Is there nothing we can do?" asked the ladybug, appealing to James. Surely you can think for a way out of this. Suddenly, they're all looking at James. Think, begged Miss Spider. Think, James, think. Come on, said the centipede. Come on, James. There must be something we can do. Their eyes waited upon him, tense, anxious, pathetically hopeful. There is something that I believe we might try, James Henry Trotter said slowly. I'm not saying it'll work. Tell us, cried the earthworm. Tell us quick. We'll try anything you say, said the centipede. But hurry, hurry, hurry. Be quiet and let the boy speak, said the ladybug. Go on, James. The owl moved a little closer to him. There was a longish pause. Go on, they cried frantically. Go on. And all the time, while they were waiting, they could hear the sharks thrashing around in the water below them. It was enough to make anyone frantic. Come on, James, the ladybug said, coaxing him. I am afraid it is not good after all, James murmured, shaking his head. I'm terribly sorry. I forgot. We don't have any string. We'd need hundreds of yards of string to make this work. What sort of string? Asked the old green grasshopper sharply. Any sort, just so long as it's strong. But my dear boy, that's exactly what we do have. We've got all you want. How? Where? The silkworm, cried the old green grasshopper. Didn't you notice the silkworm? He's still downstairs. He never moves. He just lies there sleeping all day long, but we can easily make him up and make him spin. And what about me, may I ask? Said Miss Spider. I can't just as well as my silkworm. That's more, I can spit patterns. And can't you make enough between you? Asked James. As much as you want. And quickly? Of course, of course. And would it be strong? The strongest there is. It's as thick as your finger. But why, we're going to do? I'm going to lift the beach clear out of the water, James announced it firmly. You are mad, cried the earthworm. It's our only chance. The boy's crazy. He's joking. Go on, James, the ladybug said gently. How are you going to do it? I suppose, jeered the centipede, skyhooks. Seagulls, James answered calmly. The place is full of them. Look up there. They all looked up and saw a great mass of seagulls wheeling round and round in the sky. I'm going to take a long silk string, James went on, and I'm going to loop one of the end and around the seagull's neck, and then I'm going to tie the other end to the stem of the peach. He pointed to the peach stem, which was standing up like a sort of thick mass in the middle of the deck. When I'm going to go get another seagull and go to the same thing again, then another and another. Ridiculous, they shout. Absurd. Madness. And the old green grasshopper said, how can a few seagulls lift an enormous thing like this up into the air, and all of us as well? It would take hundreds, thousands. There is no shortage of seagulls, James answered. Look for yourself. We'll probably need 400, 500, 600, maybe even 1,000. I don't know. I shall simply go on hooking them up to the steam until we have enough to lift us. They'll be looking by lift in the end. It's like balloons. You give someone enough balance to hold, really enough, then up he goes. And seagull has far more lifting power than a balloon. If only we have the time to do it, if only we are not sunk first by those awful sharks. You're absolutely off your head, said the earthworm. How on earth do you propose to get a loop of string around a seagull's neck? I suppose you're going to fly up there yourself and catch it? The boy's dirty, said the centipede. Let him finish, said the ladybug. Go on, James. How would you do it? With bait. Bait? What sort of bait? With a worm, of course. Seagulls love worms. Didn't you know that? And luckily for us, we have here the biggest, fattest, pinkest, juiciest earthworm in the world. You can stop right there, the earthworm said sharply. That's quite enough. Go on, the other said, beginning to grow interest. Go on. The seagulls have already spotted him, James continued. That's why there are so many of them circling around, but they aren't come down to get him while all the rest of us are standing here. So this is what. Stop, cried the earthworm. Stop, stop, stop. I refuse. I Be quiet, said the centipede. Mind your own business. I like that. My dear earthworm, you are going to be eaten anyway, so what difference does it make whether it's sharks or seagulls? I won't do it. Why don't we hear that the plan is first, said the old green grasshopper. I don't give a hoot what the plan is, cried the earthworm. I'm not going to be picked to death by a bunch of seagulls. You'll be a matred, said the centipede. I shall respect you for the rest of my life. So will I, said Miss Spider, and your name will be all the newspapers. Earthworm gives life to say. Why, it's absolutely brilliant, cried the old green grasshopper when James had explained his plan. The boy's a genius, the centipede announced. Now I can keep my boots on after all. Oh, I shall be pecked to death, wailed the poor earthworm. Of course you won't. I will, I know I will. And I won't even be able to see thee coming at me because I have no eyes. James went over and put an arm gently around the earthworm's shoulders. I won't let them touch you, he said. I promise I won't, but we've got to hurry. Look down there. There were more sharks than ever now round the beach. The water was boiling with them. There must have been 90 or 100 at least, and to the travellers up on top, it certainly seemed as though the beach were sinking lower and lower into the water. Action stations, James shouted. Jump to it. There's no a moment to lose. He was the captain now, and everyone knew it. They would do whatever he told him. All hands below deck except Earthworm, he ordered. Yes, yes, they all said eagerly, as they scuttled into the tunnel entrance. "Come on, let's hurry!" "And you, centipede," James shouted, "hop downstairs and get the silkworm to work at once. Tell him to spin, and he's never spun before. Our lives depends upon it. And the same applies to you, Miss Spider. Hurry on down. Start spinning." In a few minutes, everybody was ready. It was very quiet on the top of the beach. There was nobody inside, nobody except the earthworm. One half of the earthworm, looking like a great, thick, juicy pink sausage, lay innocently in the sun for all the seagulls to see. The other half of him was dangling down the tunnel. James was crouching close beside the earthworm in the tunnel entrance, just below the surface, waiting to the first seagull. He had a loop of zinc string in his hand. The old green grasshopper and the ladybug were farther down the tunnel, holding onto the earthworm's tail, ready to pull him quickly in out of danger as soon as James gave the word. And far below, in a great hollow stone of the beach, the glowworm was lighting up the room so that the two spinners, the silkworm and Miss Spider, could see that they were doing. The centipede was down there, too, exhorting them both frantically to greater efforts, and every now and again James could hear his voice coming up faintly from the depths, shouting, "Spin, silkworm, spin, you great fat lazy brute! Faster, faster, or we throw you to the sharks! Here comes the first seagull," whispered James. "Keep still now, earthworm, keep still. The rest of you get ready to pull. Please don't let it spike me," begged the earthworm. I won't. Shh." Out of the corner of one eye, James watched the seagull as it came swooping down towards the earthworm. And then, suddenly, it was so close that he could see the small black eyes of its curved beak, and the beak was open, ready to grab a nice piece of flesh out of the earthworm's back. "Pull!" shouted James. The old green grasshopper and the ladybug gave the earthworm's tail an enormous tug. Like magic, the earthworm disappeared into the tunnel. At the same time, up went James' hand, and the seagull flew right into the loop of silk that he was holding out. The loop, which had been cleverly made, tightened just the right amount, not too much, around its neck, and the seagull was captured. "Hooray!" shouted the old green grasshopper, peering out of the tunnel. "Well done, James!" Up flew the seagull, with James paying out of the silk string as it went. He gave it about 50 yards and then tied it and string to the stem of the beach. "Next one," he shouted, jumping back into the tunnel. "If you get it again, earthworm, bring up some more silk, centipede." "Oh, don't like this at all," wailed the earthworm. "If only just missed me. I ever feel the wind on my back as it went wishing past." "Shh," whispered James. "Keep still. here comes another one." So they did it again and again and again, and the seagulls kept coming, and James caught them one after another and tethered them to the peach stem. 100 seagulls, he shouted, wiping the sweat from his face. "Keep going," they cried. "Keep going, James." 200 seagulls, 300 seagulls, 400 seagulls. The shark, as though sensing that they were in danger of losing their prey, were hurling themselves at the peach more furiously than ever, and the peach was sinking lower and lower still in the water. 500 seagulls, James shouted. "Silkworm says he's running out of silk," yelled the centipede from below. "He says he can't keep it up much longer, nor can Miss Spider." "Tell them that they've got to," James answered. "They can't stop now." "We're lifting," somebody shouted. "No, we're not. I felt it. Put on another single, quick. Quiet, everybody, quiet. Here's one coming now." There was the 501st single, and the moment that James caught it and tethered it into the stem with all the others, the whole enormous peach suddenly started rising up slowly out of the water. "Look out! Here we go! Hold on, boys!" But then it stopped, and there it hung. It hovered and swayed, but it went so no higher. No bottom of it was just touching the water. It was like a delicately balanced scale that needed only the tiniest push to dip in one way or the other. "One more will do it," shouted the old green grasshopper, looking out of the tunnel. "We're almost there." And now came the big moment. Quickly, the 502nd single was caught and harnessed to the peach stem. And then suddenly, but slowly, majestically, like some fabulous golden balloon, with all the singles straining at all the strings above, the giant peach rose up, dripping out of the water, and began climbing toward the heavens. In a flash, everybody was up on top. "Oh, isn't it beautiful?" they cried. "What a marvelous feeling! Goodbye, sharks. Oh boy, this isn't the way to travel." Miss Spider, who was literally squealing with excitement, grabbed the centipede by the waist, and the two of them started dancing round and round the peach stem together. The earthworm stood up on his tail and did not a sort of wriggle of joy all by himself. The old green grasshopper kept hopping higher and higher in the air. The ladybug rushed over and shook James warmly by the hand. The glowworm, who at the best of times was a very shy and silent creature, sat glowing with pleasure near the tunnel entrance. Even the silkworm, looking white and thin and completely exhausted, came creeping out of the tunnel to watch this miracle's ascent. Up and up they went, and soon they were as high as the top of the church steeple above the ocean. "I'm a bit worried about the peach," James said to the others as soon as all the dancing and the shouting had stopped. "I wonder how much damage those sharks have gone to it underneath," it's quite impossible to tell from up here. Why don't I go over the side and make an inspection?" Miss Spider said. "It'll be no trouble at all, I assure you." And without waiting for an answer, she quickly produced a length of silk thread and attached the end of it to the peach stem. "I'll be back in a jiffy," she said, and then she walked calmly over to the edge of the peach and jumped off, paying out to the thread behind her as she fell. The others crowded anxiously around the place where she had gone over. "Wouldn't it be dreadful if the thread broke?" the ladybug said. There was a rather long silence. "Are you right, Miss Spider?" shouted the old green grasshopper. "Yes, thank you," her voice answered from below. "I'm coming up now." And up she came, climbing foot over foot up the silk thread, at the time tucking the thread back cleverly into her body as she climbed past. "Is it awful?" she asked her. "It's at all eaten away. All these great holes in it everywhere." Miss Spider clambered back onto the deck with a pleased but also a rather puzzled look on her face. "You won't believe this," she said, "but actually there is hardly any damage down there at all. The peach is almost untouched. There are just a few tiny pieces out of it where and there, but nothing more." "You must be mistaken," James told her. "Of course she's mistaken," the centipede said. "I promise you I'm not," Miss Spider answered. "But there were hundreds of sharks around us. They churned the water into a froth. We saw their great mouth opening and shutting." "I don't care what you saw," Miss Spider answered. "They certainly didn't do much damage to the peach." "Then they did we start sinking?" the centipede asked. "Perhaps we didn't start sinking," the old green grasshopper suggested. "Perhaps we were all so frightened that we simply imagined it." In this point of fact was closer to the truth than any of them knew. A shark, you see, has an extremely long, sharp nose, and its mouth is set very awkwardly underneath in the face, along one's back. This makes it more or less impossible for it to get its teeth into a vast, smooth, curving surface such as the side of the peach. Even if the creature turns onto its back, it still can't do it, because the nose always gets in the way. If you have even seen a small duckling trying to get its teeth into an enormous ball, then you will be able to imagine roughly how it was with the sharks and the peach. "It must have been some kind of magic," the ladybug said. "The holes must have held up by themselves." "Oh, look, there is a ship below us," shouted James. Everybody rushed to the side and peered over. None of them had ever seen a ship before. "It looks like a big one. It's got 3 funnels. You can even see the people on the desks. Let's wave to them. Do you think they can't see us?" Neither James nor any of the others knew it, but the ship was that now passing beneath them was actually the Queen Mary sailing out of the English Channel on her way to America. And on the bridge of the Queen Mary, the astonished captain was standing with a group of his officers, and all of them gaping at the great round ball hovering overhead. "I don't like it," the captain said. "Nor do I," said the first officer. "Do you think it's following us?" said the second officer. "I tell you, I don't like it," muttered the captain. "It could be dangerous," the first officer said. "That's it," cried the captain. "It's a secret weapon. Holy cats! Send a message to the Queen at once. The country must be warned. And give me my telescope." The first officers handed the telescope to the captain. The captain put it into his eye. "There's birds everywhere," he cried. "The whole sky is steaming with birds. What in the world are they doing? And wait a second. There are people on it. I can't see them moving. Do I have the darn thing focused right? It looks like a little boy in short trousers. Yes, I can distinctly see a little boy in short trousers standing up there. There's a sort of giant ladybug." "Now, just a minute, Captain," the first officer said. "And a colossal green grasshopper." "Captain," the first officer said sharply. "Captain, please. And a mammoth spider." "Oh dear, he's been as a whiskey again," whispered the second officer. A simply enormous centipede," screamed the captain. "Call the ship's doctor," the first officer said. "Our captain is not well." A moment later, the great round hull disappeared into a cloud, and the people on the ship never saw it again. But up on the beach itself, everyone was still happy and excited. "I wonder where we'll finish up this time," the earthworm said. "Who cares?" they answered. "Seagulls always go back to land sooner or later." Up and up they went, high above the highest clouds, the beach swaying gently from side to side as it floated along. "Wouldn't this be a perfect time for a little music?" the ladybug asked. "How about it, old grasshopper?" "With pleasure, dear lady," the old green grasshopper answered, bowing from the waist. "Oh, hooray! He's going to play for us!" they cried, and immediately the whole company sat themselves down in a circle around the old green musician, and the concert began. From the moment that the first note was struck, the audience became completely spellbound. And as for James, never had he heard such beautiful music as this. In the garden at home or summer evening, he had listened many times to the sound of grasshoppers chirping in the grass, and he had always liked the noise that they made. But this was a different kind of noise altogether. This was a real music, chords, harmonies, tunes, and all the rest of it. And what a wonderful instrument the old green grasshopper playing upon. It was like a violin. It was almost exactly as though we were playing upon a violin. The bow of the violin, the part that moved, was his back leg. The string of the violin, the part that made the sound, was the edge of his wing. He was using only the top of his back leg, the thigh, and he was stroking this up and down against the edge of his wings with incredible skill, sometimes slowly, sometimes fast, but always with the same easy flowing action. It was precisely the way a clever violinist would have used his bow, and the music came pouring out and filled the whole blue sky around them with the magic melodies. When the first bar was finished, everyone clapped madly, and Miss Spider stood up and shouted, "Bravo! Encore! Give us some more!" "Did you like that, James?" the old green grasshopper asked, smiling at the small boy. "Oh, I love it," James answered. "It was beautiful. It was as though you had a real violin in your hands. A real violin!" The old green grasshopper cried. "Good heavens, I like that. My dear boy, I'm a real violin. It's a part of my own body." "But do all grasshoppers play their music on violins the same way as you do?" James asked him. "No," he answered, "not at all. If you want to know, I happen to be a short-horned grasshopper. I have 2 short feelers coming out of my head. Can't you see them? There they are. They're quite short, aren't they? That's why they call me a shorthorn. And we shorthorns are the only ones who play our music in the violin style using a bow. My long-horned relatives, the ones who have long curvy feelers coming out of their heads, make their music simply by rubbing the edges of their 2 wings together. They are not violinists, they are wing rubbers, and rather interior noise these wing rubbers produce. If it's many so, it sounds more like a banjo than a fiddle." "How fantastic all of this!" cried James. "And to think that up until now I had never wondered how a grasshopper made his sounds." "My dear young fellow," the old green grasshopper said gently, "there are whole lots of things in this world of ours that you haven't started wondering about yet. There are, for example, 2 things that I keep my ears." "Your ears? Why, in your head, of course." Everyone burst out laughing. "You mean you don't even know that?" cried the centipede. "Try again," said the old green grasshopper, smiling at James. "You can't possibly keep them anywhere else." "Oh, can't I? Well, I give up. Where do you keep them?" "Right here," the old green grasshopper said, "and on each side of my tummy." "It's not true." "Of course it's true. That's so peculiar about that. You ought to see there my cousins, the crickets and the katydids, keep theirs." "Where do they keep them?" "In their legs. One each front leg, just below the knee." "You mean you didn't know that either?" the centipede said. "You're joking," James said. "Nobody could possibly have his ears in his legs." "Why not?" Because it's ridiculous, that's why. You know that I think it's ridiculous," the centipede said, grinning away as usual. I don't mean to be rude, but I think it is ridiculous to have hairs on the size of one's head. It certainly looks ridiculous. You ought to take a peek in the mirror someday and see for yourself. Best, cried the earthworm. Why might you always be so rude and rambunctious to everyone? You ought to apologize to James at once. James didn't want the earthworm and the centipede to get into another argument, so he said quickly to the earthworm, "Tell me, do you play any kind of music?" "No, but I do other things, some of which are really quite extraordinary," the earthworm said. "Such as what?" asked James. "Well," the earthworm said, "next time you stand in a field or in a garden and look around you, just remember this, that every grain of soil upon the surface of the land, every tiny little bit of soil you can see, has actually passed through the body of an earthworm during the last few years. Isn't that wonderful?" "It is not impossible," said James. "You mean you actually swallow soil?" "Like mad," the earthworm said proudly. "If one end and now the other. But what's the point?" "What do you mean?" "That's the point. Why do you do this?" "We do it for the farmers. It makes the soil nice and light and crumbly so that things will grow well in it. If you really want to know, the farmers couldn't do without us. We are essential, we are vital, so it is only natural that the farmer should love us. He loves us even more, I believe, than he loves the ladybug." "The ladybug," James turned to look at her. "Do they love you too?" "I'm told that they do," the ladybug answered modestly, blushing all over. "In fact, I understand that in some places the farmers love us so much that they go out and buy live ladybugs by the sackful and take them home and set them free in their fields. They are very pleased, and they have lots of ladybugs in their fields." "But why?" James asked. "Because we gobble up all the nasty little insects, and then gobbling up the farmers' crops. It helps enormously, and we ourselves don't charge a penny for our services." "I think you are wonderful," James told her. "Can I ask you a special question?" "Please do." "Well, it is really true that I can tell how old a ladybug is by counting her spots." "Oh no, that's just a children's story," the ladybug said. "We never change our spots. Some of us, of course, are born with more spots than others, but we never change them. The number of spots that you can see is a simple way of showing which branch of the family she belongs to. For example, as you can see for yourself, I'm a 9-spotted ladybug, and I'm very lucky. It is a fine thing to be." "It is indeed," said James, gazing at the beautiful scarlet shell with 9 black spots on it. "On the other hand," the ladybugs went on, "some of my less fortunate relatives have no more than 2 spots altogether on their shells. Can you imagine that? They are called 2-spotted ladybugs, and very common and ill-mannered they are, I regret to say. And then, of course, you have the 5-spotted ladybugs as well. They're much nicer than two spotted ones, although I myself find them a trifle too saucy for my taste. But they are all of them loved, said James. Yes, the ladybug answered quietly, they are all of them loved. It seems that almost everyone around here is loved, said James. How nice this is! Not me, cried the centipede happily. I'm a pest, and I'm proud of it. Oh, I'm such a shocking, dreadful pest. Here, the earthworm said. But what about you, Miss Spider? Asked James. Aren't you also much loved in the world? Alas, no, Miss Spider answered, singing long and loud. I'm not loved at all, and yet I do nothing but good. All day long I catch flies and mosquitoes in my webs. I'm a decent person. I know you are, said James. It is very unfair the way we spiders are treated. Miss Spider went on. Why, only last week your own horrible Aunt Sponge flushed my poor dear father down on the plug hole in the bathtub. Oh, how awful, cried James. I watched the whole thing from a corner up in the ceiling, Miss Spider murmured. It was ghastly. You never saw him again. A large tear rolled down her cheek and fell with a splash on the floor. But it is not very unlucky to kill a spider, James inquired, looking round at the others. Of course it's unlucky to kill a spider, shouted the centipede. It's about the unluckiest thing anyone can do. Look what happened to Aunt Sponge after she'd done that. Bum! We all felt it, didn't we? As the peach went over her. Oh, what a lovely bump that must have been for you, Miss Spider. It was very satisfactory, Miss Spider answered. Will you sing us a song about it, please? So the centipede did. Aunt Sponge was terrifically fat and tremendously flabby, and that her tummy and waist were so gas-paced it was worse on the place where she sat. So she said, I must take myself flat, I must make myself sleek as a cat. I shall do without dinner to make myself thinner. But along come the peach, oh, the beautiful peach, and made her far thinner than that. That was very nice, Miss Spider said. Now sing one about Aunt Spiker. With pleasure, the centipede answered, grinning. Aunt Spiker was thin as a wire, and as dry as bone, only drier. She was so long and thin, if you carried her in, you could use her for poking the fire. I must do something quickly, she frowned. I want fat. I want pound upon a pound. I must eat lots and lots of marshmallows and cores till I start bulking out all around. Ah, yes, she announced, I have sworn that I'll after my finger bite down, cried the peach with a snigger. I'll alert your finger and iron her out on the lawn. Everybody clapped and called out for more songs from the centipede, who at once launched into his favorite song at all. Once upon a time, when pigs were swine, and monkeys chewed tobacco, and hens took snuff to make themselves stuff, and a duck said quick quack quaw, and Proserpines drank fiery wines, and Ghost ate tapioca, and old Mother Hubbard got stuck in this. Look out, Centipede, James cried. Look out! The centipede, who had begun dancing wildly around the deck during this song, had suddenly gone too close to the downward curving edge of the beach, and for the 3 awful seconds he had stood teetering on the brink, swinging his legs frantically in circles in an effort to stop himself from falling over backward into space. But therefore anyone could reach him, down he went. He gave a shriek of terror as he fell, and the others, rushing to the side and peering over, saw his poor long body tumbling over and over through the air, getting smaller and smaller until it was out of sight. "Silkworm," yelled James, "quick, start spinning." The silkworm sighed, for she was still very tired from spinning all that silks for the singles, but she did as she was told. "I'm going to down after him," cried James, grabbing the silk strings as it started coming out of the silkworm and tying the end of it around his waist. "The rest of you hold on to Silkworm so I don't pull her over with me, and later on, if you feel the 3 tugs of the string, start hauling me up again." He jumped, and he went tumbling down after the centipede, down, 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 toward the sea below, and you can imagine how quickly the silkworm had to spin to keep up the speed of this fall. "We'll never see either of them again," cried Ladybug. Oh dear, just what we all do so happy to," the spider cried. The glowworm and the ladybug all began to cry. So did the earthworm. "I don't care a bit about the centipede," the earthworm sobbed, "but I really did love that little boy." Very softly, the old green grasshopper started to play the funeral march on his violin, and by the time he had finished, everyone, including himself, was on the floor of tears. Suddenly, there came 3 sharp tugs on the rope. "Pull!" shouted the old green grasshopper. "Everyone get behind me and pull." There was about a mile of string to be hauled in, but they all worked together like mad, and in the end, over the side of the beach, there appeared a dripping wet James with a dripping wet centipede clinging to him tightly with all 42 on his leg. "He saved me," gaped the centipede. "He swam around in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean until he found me." "My dear boy," the old green grasshopper said, patting James on the back, "I do congratulate you." "My boots," cried the centipede. "Just look at my precious boots. They are ruined by the water." "Be quiet," the earthworm said. "You are lucky to be alive." "Are we still going up and up?" asked James. "Certainly we are," answered the old green grasshopper, "and it's beginning to get dark." "I know, it'll soon be night. Why don't we all go down below and keep warm until tomorrow morning?" Miss Spider suggested. "No," the old green grasshopper said. "I think that would be very unwise. It will be safer if we all stay here through the night and keep watch. Then if anything happens, we shall anyway be ready for it." James Henry Trotter and his companions crouched close together on top of the beach, and the night began closing in around them. Clouds like mountains towered high above their heads on all sides, mysterious, menacing, overwhelming. Gradually, it grew darker and darker, and then a pale 3/4 moon came up over the tops of the cloud and cast an airy light over the whole scene. The giant peach swayed gently from side to side as it floated along, and the hundred of silky white strings going onward from its stem were beautiful in the moonlight. So also was the great flock of seagulls overhead. There was not a sound anywhere. Traveling upon the beach was not in the least like traveling in an airplane. The airplane comes clattering and roaring through the sky, and whatever might be lurking secretly up there in the great cloud mountains goes running for cover at its approach. This is why people who travel the airplanes never see anything. But the beach, oh yes, the beach was a soft, stealthy traveler, making no noise at all as it floated along. And several times during the long silent night, right high up over the middle of the ocean in the moonlight, James and his friends saw things that no one had ever seen before. Once, as they drifted silently past a massive white cloud, they saw on the top of it a group of strange, tall, wispy-looking things that were about twice the height of ordinary men. They were not easy to see at first, because they were almost as white as the cloud itself. But as the beach sailed closer, it became obvious that these things were actually living creatures, tall, wispy, red-like, shadowy, white creatures who looked as though they were made out of a mixture of cotton wool and candy floss and thin white hairs. "Oh," the ladybug said, "I don't like this at all." "Shh," James whispered back. "Don't let them hear you. They must be cloud men." "Cloud men?" they murmured, huddling closer together for comfort. Oh dear, I'm glad I'm blind and I can see them," the earthworm said. "Or I would probably scream." "I hope they don't turn around and see us," Miss Spider stammered. "Do you think they would eat us?" the earthworm asked. "They would eat you," the centipede answered, grinning. "They would cut you up like a salami and eat you in thin slices." The poor earthworm began to quiver and roll over with fright. "But what are they doing?" the old green grasshopper whispered. "I don't know," James answered softly. "Let's watch and see." The cloud men were all standing in a group, and they were doing something peculiar with their hands. First, they would reach out, all of them at once, and grab a handful of cloud. Then they would roll these handfuls of cloud in their fingers until they turned into what looked like a large white marbles. Then they would toss the marbles to one side and quickly grab more bits of clouds and start over again. It was very silent and mysterious. The pile of mumbles beside them kept growing larger and larger. Soon there was a truckload of them there at least. "They must be absolutely mad," the centipede said. "There is nothing to be afraid of there." "Be quiet, you pests," the earthworm whispered. "We shall all be eaten if they see us." But the cloud men were much too busy with that they were doing to have noticed the great peach floating silently up in them. Then the watchers on the beach saw one of the other cloudman raising his long, wispy arms about his head, and they heard his shouting, "All right, boys, that's enough. Get the shovels." And all the other cloudmen immediately let out a strange high-pitched whoop of joy and started jumping up and down and waving their arms in the air. They picked up enormous shovels and rushed over the pile of marbles and began shoveling them as fast as they could over the side of the cloud into space. "Down they go," they shouted as they worked. "Down they go, hail and snow, freezers and sneezers, and noses will blow." "It's hailstones," whispered James excitedly. "They've been making hailstones, and now they're showering them down onto the people in the world below." "Hailstones?" the centipede said. "That's ridiculous. This is the summertime. We don't have hailstones in summertime." "They are practical for the winter," James told him. "I don't believe it," shouted the centipede, raising his voice. "Shh," the others whispered, and James said softly, "For heaven's sake, centipede, don't make so much noise." The centipede roared with laughter. "Those imbeciles couldn't hear anything," he cried. "They're deaf as doorknobs. You watch." And before anyone could stop him, he had cupped his front feet to his mouth and was yelling at the cloud man as loud as he could. "Idiots!" he yelled. "What on earth do you think you are doing over there?" The effect was immediate. The cloud men jumped around as if they had been stung by wasps. And then they saw the great golden peach floating past them, not 50 yards away in the sky. They gave a yelp of surprise and dropped their shovels in the ground. And there they stood with the moonlight streaming down all over them, absolutely motionless, like a crowd of tall, white, hairy statues, staring and staring at the gigantic fruit as it went sailing by. The passengers on the beach, all except the centipede, sat frozen with terror, looking back at the cloud man and wondering what's going on next happen. "Now you've done it, you low-stone pest," whispered the earthworm to the centipede. "I'm not frightened of them," shouted the centipede, and to show everybody once again that he wasn't, he stood up on his full length and started dancing about and making insulting signs as the cloud man with all 42 of his legs. This evidently infuriated the cloud man beyond belief. All at once they spun around and grabbed great handfuls of hailstones and rushed to the edge of the cloud and started throwing them at the beach, shrieking with fury all the time. "Look out!" cried James. "Quick, lie down, lie flat on the deck." It was lucky they did. A large hailstone can't hurt you as much as a rock or a lump of lead if it's thrown hard enough. And my goodness, how those cloud men could throw! The hailstones came whizzing through the air like bullets from the machine gun, and James could hear them smashing against the sides of the beach and burying themselves in the beach flesh with horrible squashing noises, plop, plop, and then ping, ping, as they bounced off the floor Ladybug's shell because she couldn't lie as flat as the others, and then crack, as the one of them hit the centipede right on the nose, and crack again as another of the hint came somewhere else. "Oh," he cried, "oh, stop, stop!" But the Cloud Man had no intention of stopping. James could see them rushing about on the cloud like a lot of huge hairy ghosts, picking up hailstones from the pile, dashing to the edge of the cloud, hurling the hailstones at the beach, dashing back again to get more, and then the pile of stones was all gone. They simply grabbed handfuls of cloud and make as many more as they wanted, and much bigger ones now, some of them as large as cannonballs. "Quickly," cried James, "down the tunnel, or we'll be wiped out." There was a rush for the tunnel entrance, and half a minute later everybody was safely downstairs inside the stone of the beach, trembling with fright and listening to the noise of the hailstones as they came crashing against the side of the beach. "I'm a wreck," groaned the centipede. "I'm wounded all over." "It serves you right," said the earthworm. "Would somebody kindly look and see if my shell is cracked?" the ladybug said. "Give us some light," shouted the old green grasshopper. "I can't," wailed the glowworm. "They've broken my pulp." "Then put in another one," the centipede said. "Be quiet in a moment," said James. "Listen, I do believe they're not hitting us anymore." They all stopped taking and listened. Yes, the noise has ceased. The hailstones were no longer smashing against the beach. "We've left them behind. The singles must have pulled us a yard out of danger. Hooray! Let's go up and see." Cautiously, with James going first, they all climbed and up the tunnel. James poked his head out and looked around. "It's all clear," he called. "I can't see them anywhere." One by one the travelers came out again onto the top of the beach and gazed carefully round. The moon was still shining as brightly as ever, and there were still plenty of huge shimmering cloud mountains on all sides, but there were no cloud men in sight now. "The beach is leaking," shouted the old green grasshopper, peering over the side. "It's full of holes, and the juice is dripping out of nowhere." "That does it," cried the earthworm. "If the beach is leaking then we shall surely sink." "Don't be an ass," the centipede told him. "We are not in the water now." "Oh, look!" shouted the ladybug. "Look, look, look! Over there!" Everybody swung around to look. In the distance, and directly ahead of them, they now saw a most extraordinary sight. It was a kind of arch, a colossal curve-shaped thing that reached high up into the sky and came down again at both ends. The ends were resting upon a huge flat cloud that was as big as a desert. "Now, what in the world is that?" asked James. "It's a bridge. It's an enormous hoop cut in half. It's in a giant horseshoe standing upside down." "Stop me if I'm wrong," murmured the centipede, going white in the face. "But might those not be cloud men climbing all over it?" There was a dreadful silence. The beach floated closer and closer. "They're cloud men," There are hundreds of them, thousands, millions. I don't want to hear about it, shrieked the poor blind earthworm. I'd rather be on the end of the fish hook and use the bait than come up against those terrible creatures again. I'd rather be fried alive and eaten by a Mexican, wailed the old green grasshopper. Please keep quiet, whispered James. It's our only hope. They crouched very still on the top of the beach, starting at the cloud man. The whole surface of the cloud was literally swarming with them. And there were hundreds more up above, climbing about on the monstrous crazy arch. But what is that thing? Whispered the ladybug, and what are they going to do it? I don't care what they're going to it. But centipede said, scouting over to the tunnel entrance, I'm not staying up there. Goodbye. But the rest of them were too frightened or too hypnotized by the whole affair to make a move. But do you know what? James whispered. What? They said what? That enormous arch. They seem to be painting it. They've got pots of paint and big brushes. You look. And he was quite right. The travelers were close enough now to see that this was exactly what the cloudmen were doing. They all had huge brushes in their hands, and they were splashing the paint onto the great curvy arch in a frenzy of speed. So fast, in fact, that in a few minutes the whole of the earth became covered with the most glorious colors, reds, blues, greens, yellows, and purples. It's a rainbow, everyone said at once. They are making a rainbow. Oh, isn't it beautiful? Said, look at those colors. Centipede, they shouted. You must come up and see this. They were so enthralled by the beauty and brilliance of the rainbow that they forgot to keep their voices low any longer. The centipede poked his head cautiously out of the tunnel entrance. Well, 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 he said. I've always wondered how those things were made. But why all the ropes? Why are they doing the ropes? Good heavens! And they're pushing it off the cloud, cried James. There it goes. They are lowering it down to the earth with ropes. And I'll tell you something else, the centipede said sharply. If I'm not greatly mistaken, we are all ourselves are going to bump into right now. Bless my soul, he's right, the old green grasshopper exclaimed. The rainbow was now dangling in the air below the cloud. The beach was also just below the level of the cloud, and it was heading directly toward the rainbow, traveling rather fast. We are lost, Miss Spider cried, wringing her feet again. The end has come. I can't stand it, Miss Spider cried. We're going to miss it, shouted the ladybug. No, we are not. Yes, we are. Yes, no, oh my heavens. Hold on, everybody, James called out, and suddenly there was a tremendous draught at the beach, went crashing into the top part of the rainbow. This was followed by an awful splintering noise, as the enormous rainbow snapped right across the middle and became two separate pieces. The next thing that happened was extremely unfortunate. The ropes that the cloud man had been using for lowering the rainbow got tangled up with the sing strings that went up from the beach to the seagulls. The beach was trapped. Panic, and pandemonium broke out among the travelers, and James Henry Trotter, glancing up quickly, saw the faces of 1,000 furious cloud men peering down at him over the edge of the cloud. The faces had almost no shape at all because of the long white hairs that covered them. There were no noses, no mouths, no ears, no chins, only the eyes were visible in each face. 2 small black eyes glinting malevolently through the hairs. Then came the most frightening thing for all. One cloud man, a huge hairy creature who must have been 14 feet tall at least, suddenly stood up and made a tremendous leap off the side of the cloud, trying to get to one of the sing strings above the pitch. James and his friends saw him flying through the air above them, with arms outstretched in front of him, reaching for the nearest string, and they saw him grab it and cling to it with his hands and legs. And then, very, very slowly, hand over hand, he began to come down the string. "Mercy, help, save us," cried the ladybug. "He's coming down to eat us," while the old green grasshopper jumped overboard. "Then eat the earthworm first," shouted the centipede. "It is not good eating me. I'm full of bones, like a keeper." "Centipede," yelled James, "quickly, bite through the ring." And once coming down on, the centipede rushed over to the stem of the beech and took the sing string in his teeth and bit through it with the snap of his jaws. Immediately, far above them, a single seagull was seen to come away from the rest of the flock and flying off with a long string trailing from his neck. And clinging desperately to the end of the string, shouting and cursing with fury, was the huge fairy cloud man. Up and up he went, swinging across the moonlit sky, and James Henry Trotter, watching him with delight, said, "My goodness, he must weigh almost nothing at all for the seagull to be able to pull him like that. He must be all hair and air." The rest of the cloud men were so flabbergasted at seeing one of their company carried away in the manner that they let get the ropes they were holding. And then, of course, down went the rainbow, both halves of it together, tumbling toward the earth below. This freed the pitch, which at once began sailing away from the terrible cloud. But the travelers were not in the clear yet. The infuriated cloudmen jumped up and ran after them along the clouds, pelting them mercilessly with all sorts of hard and horrible objects. Empty paint buckets, paint brushes, step ladders, stools, saucepans, frying pans, rotten eggs, dead rats, bottles of hair oil, anything that those brutes could lay their hands on came raining down upon the beach. One cloud man, taking very careful aim, tipped a gallon of thick purple paint over the edge of the cloud right onto the centipede himself. The centipede screamed with anger. "My legs," he cried, "they are sticking together. I can't walk, and my eyelids won't open. I can't see, and my boots are ruined." But the most everyone far too busy dodging the things that the cloud men were throwing to pay any attention to the centipede. "The paint is drying," he moaned, It's going hard. I can't move my legs. I can't move anything. You can still move your mouth, the earthworm said, and that's a great pity. James, bawled the centipede, please help me. Wash off this paint. Scrape it off. Anything. It seemed like a long time before the seagulls were able to pull the pitch away from the horrible rainbow cloud. But they managed it at last, and then everybody gathered around the wretched centipede and began arguing about the best way to get the paint off his body. He really did look at sight. He was purple all over, and now that the paint was beginning to dry and harden, he was forced to sit very stiff and upright, as though they were encased in cement, and all 32 of his legs were sticking out straight in front of him like rods. He tried to say something, but his lips wouldn't move. All the god could do was gurgling noises in his throat. The old green grasshopper reached out and touched him carefully on the stomach. But how could it possibly have dried so quickly? He asked. I desert pain, Miss Spider announced. It frightens me. It reminds me of Aunt Spiker. The late Aunt Spiker, because the last time she painted her kitchen ceiling, my poor darling grandmother stepped into it by mistake when it was still wet, and there it stuck. And all through the night we could hear her calling to us, saying, help, help, and it was heartbreaking to listen to her, but what would we do? Not a thing until the next day when the paint had dried, and then of course we all rushed over to her and calmed her down and gave some food. Believe it or not, she lived for 6 months like that, upside down on the ceiling, where her legs stuck permanently in the paint. She really did. We fed her every day. We brought her fresh flies straight from the web. But then, on the 26th of April last, Aunt Sponge, the light Aunt Sponge, happened to glance up at the ceiling, and she spotted her. A spider, she cried. A disgusting spider. Quick, fetch me the mop with a long handle. And then, oh, it was awful. I can't bear thinking of it. The spider wiped away a tear and looked sadly at the centipede. You poor thing, she murmured. I do feel sorry for you. It'll never come off, the earthworm said brightly. Our centipede will never move again. He will turn into a statue, and we shall be able to put him in the middle of the lawn with a bird bath on the top of his head. We couldn't try peeling like a banana, the old green grasshopper suggested, or rubbish with sandpaper, the ladybug said. Now with it stuck out his tongue, the earthworm said, smiling a little for perhaps that first time in his life. If he stuck it out really far, then we could all catch hold of it and start pulling, and if we pulled hard enough, we could turn him inside out and he would have a new skin. There was a pause while the others considered the interesting proposal. I think, James said slowly, I think that the best thing to do, that he hoped, and stopped. What was that? He asked quickly. I hear a voice. I heard someone shouting. They all raised their heads, listening. Shh, there is again. But the voice was too far away from them to hear that it was saying. It is a cloud man, Miss Spider cried. I just know it is a cloud man. They're after us again. It came from above, the earthworm said, and automatically everybody looked upward, everybody except the centipede, who couldn't move. "Ouch!" they said. "Help, mercy, we're going to catch him this time," for that they now saw, swirling and twisting directly over their heads, was an immense black cloud, a terrible, dangerous, thundery-looking thing that began to rumble and roar even as they were staring at it. And then, from high up on the top of the cloud, the faraway voice came down to them once again, this time very loud and clean. "Oh, with the faucets!" it shouted. "On with the faucets! On with the faucets!" 3 seconds later, the hole underneath of the clouds seemed to split and burst open like a paper bag. And then out came the water. They saw it coming. It was quite easy to see because it wasn't just raindrops. It was raindrops at all. It was a great solid mass of water. It might have been a lake or a whole ocean dropping out of the sky on top of them. And down it came, down and down, crashing first onto the singles and then onto the beach itself, while the poor travelers shrieked with fear and dropped around frantically for something to catch hold of. The beach steam, the silk strings, anything that could find, and all the time the water came pouring and roaring down upon them, bouncing and smashing and sloshing and slashing and washing and swirling and surging and wriggling and goggling and gushing and rushing, and it was like being pinned down underneath the biggest waterfall in the world and not being able to get out. They couldn't speak, they couldn't see, they couldn't breathe, and James Henry Trotter, holding on manfully to one of the silk strings above the beach stem, told himself that this must be surely to be the end of everything at last. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the deluge stopped. They were out, and it was all over. The wonderful singles had flown right through, and it had come out safely on the other side. Once again, the giant beach was sailing peacefully through the mysterious moonlit sky. "I'm drowned," gaped the old green grasshopper, spitting out water by the pint. "It has gone right through my skin," the earthworm groaned. "I always thought my skin was waterproof, but it isn't, and now I'm full of pain." Look at me," shouted the centipede excitedly. "It's washed me clean. The pain's all gone. I can move again." "That's the worst news I've had in a long time," the earthworm said. The centipede was dancing around the deck and turning somersaults in the air and singing at the top of his voice. "Oh, hooray for the storm and the rain! I can move, I don't feel any pain. And I know I'm a pest, I'm a biggest and best, the most marvelous pest once again." "Oh, do shut up," the old green grasshopper said. "Look at me," cried the centipede. "Look at me. I'm freed, I'm freed. Not a scratch, not a bruise, nor a bleed. To his grave he this fine can't." And all thought they had sent, and I very near went, oh, I very near went, but I sent quite the wrong centipede. "How fast we're going off all a sudden," the ladybug said. "I wonder why." "I don't think the seagulls like this place any better than we do," James answered. "I imagine they want to get out of it as soon as they can. They got a bad fright, and at that storm we've just been through." Faster and faster flew the seagulls, skimming across the sky at a tremendous pace, with the pitch trailing out behind them. Cloud after cloud went on by either side, and one of them ghostly white in the moonlight, and several more times during the night travelers caught glimpses of cloud men moving round on the tops of these clouds, working their tiniest magic upon the world below. Once they passed a snow machine in operation, with the cloud man turning the handle and a blizzard of snowflakes blowing out of the great funnel above. They saw the huge drums that they were used for making thunder, and the cloud man beating them furiously with long hammers. They saw the frost factories and the wind producers, and the places the cyclones and tornadoes were manufactured, and sand spinning down towards the earth. And at once, deep in a hollow of a large billowy cloud, they spotted something that could only have been a cloud-man's city. There were caves everywhere running into the cloud, and the entrances to the caves, the cloudsmen's wives were crouching over little stoves with frying pans in their hands, frying snowballs for their husbands' suppers, and hundreds of cloudsmen's children were frisking about all over the place and shrieking with laughter and sliding down the billows of the cloud on toboggans. An hour later, just before dawn, the travelers heard a soft whooshing noise above their heads, and they glanced up and saw an immense grey bat-like creature swooping down toward them out of the dark. It circled round and round to the pitch, flapping its great wings slowly in the moonlight and staring at the travelers. Then it uttered a series of long, deep, melancholy cries and flew off again into the night. "Oh, I do wish we morning would come," Miss Spider said, shivering all over. "I won't be long now," James answered. "Look, it's getting higher over there already." And all they sat in silence, watching in the sun, and they came up slowly over the rim of the horizon for a new day. And then, full of daylight, came at last. They all got to their feet and scratched their poor cramped bodies, and then the centipede, who always seemed to see things first, shouted, "Look, there is land below." "He's right," they cried, running to the edge of the pitch and peering over. "Hooray, hooray! It looks like streets and houses, but how enormous it all is!" A vast city, glistening in the early morning sunshine, lay spread out 3,000 feet below them, and that high the cars were like little beetles crawling along the streets, and people walking on the pavements looked no larger than tiny grains of soot. "But what a tremendous tall buildings!" exclaimed the ladybug. "I've never seen anything like them before in England. Which town do you think it is?" "This couldn't possibly be England," said the only green grasshopper. "Then where is it?" asked Miss Spider. "You know what those buildings are?" shouted James, jumping up and down with excitement. "Those are skyscrapers, so this must be America. And that, my friend, means that we have crossed the Atlantic Ocean overnight." "You don't mean it," they cried. "It is not possible. It's incredible. It's unbelievable. Oh, I always dreamed of going to America," cried the centipede. "I had a friend wants who. Be quiet, said the earthworm. Who cares about your friend? The thing we've got to think about now is how on earth are we going to get down to earth? Asked James. Said the ladybug. I don't think that should be so very difficult, James told them. And we all have to do is to cut loose a few singles, not too many, mind you, but just enough so that the others can quite keep us up in the air. Then down we shall go, slowly and gently, until we reach the ground. Centipede will bite through the strings for us one at a time. Far below them, in the city of New York, something like pandemonium was breaking out. A great round ball, as big as a house, had been seen hovering high up in the sky over the very center of Manhattan, and the cry had gone up, and it was an enormous bomb sent by another country to blow the whole city to smithereens. Air raid sirens began wailing in every section. All radio and television programs were interrupted with announcement that the population must go down in their cellars immediately. 1 million people walking in the streets on their way to work looked up into the sky and saw the monster hovering above them, and started running for the nearest subway entrance to take cover. Generals grabbed hold of telephones and shouted orders to everyone they could think of. The mayor of New York called up the presidents of the United States down in Washington, D.C. to ask him for help, and the president, who at the moment was having breakfast in his pajamas, quickly pushed away his half-finished plate of sugar crisps and started pressing buttons right and left to summon in his admirals and generals. And all the way across the vast stretch of America, in the 50 states, from Alaska to Florida, from Pennsylvania to Hawaii, the alarm was sounded, and the word went out that the biggest bomb in the history of the world was hovering over New York City, and that at any moment it might go off. Come on, Centipede, bite through the first string, James ordered. The centipede took one of the silk strings between his teeth and bit through it. At once again, but not with an angry cloud man dangling from the end of the string this time. A single came away from the rest of the flock and went flying off on his own. Bite another, James ordered. The centipede bit through another string. Why aren't we singing? We are singing. No, we are not. Don't forget, the pitch is a lot lighter now than we started out, James told them. It lost an awful lot of juice, and all those hailstones hit in the night cut away 2 more singles, Centipede. Ah, that's better. Here we go. Now we're really sinking. Yes, this is perfect. Don't bite any more, Centipede, or we'll sink too fast. Gently does it. Slowly the great pitch began losing high, and the buildings and streets down below began coming closer and closer. Do you think we'll get our pictures in the papers when we get down? The ladybug asked. My goodness, I've forgotten to polish my boots, the centipede said. Everyone must help me to polish my boots before we arrive. Oh, for heaven's sake, said the earthworm, can you ever stop thinking about? But he ever finished his sentence, for suddenly whoosh, and they looked up and saw a huge four-engine plane come shooting out of a nearby cloud and go whistling past them no more than 20 feet over their heads. This was actually the regular early morning passenger plane coming into New York from Chicago, and as it went by, it sliced right through every single one of the silken strings, and immediately the seagulls broke away, and the enormous beach having nothing to hold it up in the air any longer, went tumbling down toward the earth like a lump of lead. "Help!" cried the centipede. "Save us!" cried Miss Spider. "We are lost!" cried the ladybug. "This is the end!" cried the old green grasshopper. "James!" cried the earthworm. "Do something, James!" "I can't!" cried James. "I'm sorry. Goodbye. Shut your eyes, everybody. It won't be long now." Round and round and upside down went the beach as it plummeted over the earth, and they were all clinging desperately to the steam to save themselves from being flung into space. Faster and faster it fell, down and down and down, racing closer and closer to the houses and the streets below, where it would surely small into a million pieces when it hit. And all the way along Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue and along all other streets in the city, people who had not yet reached the underground shelters looked up and saw it coming, and they stopped running and stood there staring in sort of stupor, and what they thought was the biggest bomb in all the world falling out of the sky onto their heads. A few women screamed, others knelt down on the sidewalk and began praying aloud. Strong men turned to one another and said things like, "I guess it is Joe," and "Goodbye, everybody, goodbye," and for the next 30 seconds the whole city held its breath, waiting for the end to come. "Goodbye, Ladybug," gasped James, clinging to the stem of the fallen peach. "Goodbye, Centipede. Goodbye, everybody. There were only a few seconds to go now, and it looked as though they were going to fall right in among the tallest buildings. James could see the skyscrapers running up to meet them at the most awful speed, and most of them had square, flat tops, but the very tallest of them all had a top that tapered off at a long sharp point, like an enormous silver needle, sticking up into the sky. And it was precisely on the top of the needle that Peach fell. There was a squash, a needle went in deep, and suddenly there was the giant Peach caught and spiked upon the very pinnacle of the Empire State Building. It was a really amazing sight, and in 2 or 3 minutes, as soon as the people below realized that this now couldn't possibly to be a bomb, they came pouring out of the shelters and the subways to gape at the marvel. The streets for half a mile round and the building were jammed with men and women, and then the word spread that there were actually living things moving about on the top of the great round ball. Then everyone went wild with excitement. "It's a flying saucer," they shouted. "They are from outer space. They are from Mars. Or maybe they came from the moon." And a man who had a pair of binoculars to his I said. "They look pretty peculiar to me, I'll tell you that." Police cars and fire engines came screaming all over the city and pulled up outside the Empire State Building. 200 firemen and 600 policemen swarmed into the building and went up in the elevators as high as they could go, and they poured down onto the observation roof, which is the place where tourists stand at the bottom of the big spike. All the policemen were holding their guns and ready, with their fingers on the triggers, and the firemen were clutching their hatchets, but from where they stood, almost directly underneath the pitch, they couldn't actually see the travelers up on top. "Ahoy there!" shouted the chief of police. "Come out and show yourselves." Suddenly, the great brown head of the centipede appeared over the side of the pitch. His black eyes, as large, as round as two marbles, glared down at the policeman and the firemen below. Then his monstrous, ugly face broke into a wild grin. The policemen and the firemen all started shouting at once. "Look out!" they cried. "It's a dragon!" "It's not a dragon, it's a wampus, it's a gorgon, it's a sea serpent, it's a proc, it's a manticore." 3 firemen and 5 policemen fainted and had to be carried away. "It's no danger," cried the chief of police. "It's a rangdoodle," yelled the head of the fire department. The centipede kept on grinning. He seemed to be enjoying enormously the commotion that he was causing. "Now, see here," shouted the chief of police, cupping his hands to his mouth. "Listen to me. I want you to tell me exactly where you've come from." "We've come from thousands of miles away," the centipede shouted back, grinning more broadly than ever, showing his brown teeth. "There you are!" cried the chief of police. "I told you they came from Mars." "I guess you're right," said the head of the department. At this point, the old green grasshopper poked his huge green head over the side of the pitch, alongside the centipedes. 6 months more big, strong men fainted when they saw him. "That's one zoink!" screamed the head of the department. I just know that it's an oink." "Or a cock-crate," yelled the chief of police. "Stand back, man. It may jump down on us any moment." "What on earth are they talking about?" the old green grasshopper said to the centipede. "Search me," the centipede answered. "But they seem to be in all awful stew about something." Then Miss Spider's large black murderous-looking head, which to a stranger was probably the most terrifying of all, appeared next to the grasshopper's. "Snakes and ladders!" yelled the head of the department. "We are finished now. It's a giant scorpula." "It's worse than that," cried the chief of police. "It's a verminous nest. Oh, just look at his verminous gruesome face." "Is that the kind that eats fully grown men for breakfast?" the head of the fire department asked, going white as a sheet. "I'm afraid it is," the chief of police answered. "Oh, please, why doesn't someone help us to get down from there?" Miss Spider called out. It's making me giddy." "This could be a trick," said the head of the department. "Don't anyone make a move until I say." "They've probably got space guns," muttered the chief of police. "But we've got to do something," the head of the department announced grimly. "About 5 million people are standing down there on the streets watching us." "Then why don't you put up a ladder?" the chief of police asked him. "I'll stand at the bottom and hold it steady for a while if you get up and see what's happening." "Thank you very much," snapped the head of the fire department. Soon there were no less than 7 large fantastic faces peering down over the side of the pitch. The centipede, the old grasshopper, meat spider and earthworm, the ladybug, the silkworm and the glowworms, and a sort of panic was beginning to break out among the firemen and the policemen of the rooftop. Then all at once the panic stopped, and a great gasp of astonishment welled up all around. For now a small boy was seen to be standing up there beside the other creatures. His hair was blowing in the wind, and he was laughing and waving and calling out, "Hello, everybody! Hello!" For a few moments the men below just stood and stared and gaped. They simply couldn't believe their eyes. "Bless my soul!" cried the head of the fire department, going red in the face. "It really is a little boy, isn't it? Don't be frightened for us, please," James called out. "We are so glad to be here." "What about those others beside you?" shouted the chief of the police. "Are any of them dangerous?" "Of course they are not dangerous," James answered. "They are the nicest creatures in the world." "Allow me to introduce them to you one by one, and then I'm sure you'll believe me. My friends, this is the centipede, and let me make it known. He's so sweet and gentle that, although he's overgrown, the Queen of Spain again and again has summoned him by phone to babysit and sing and knit and be a chaperone when nurse is off and all the royal children are alone." "Small wonder," said a fireman, "they are no longer on the throne." "The earthworm, on the other hand," said James, beginning to expand, "it's great for digging up the land and making old soils never. Moreover, you should understand, we would be absolutely grand for digging subway tunnels and for making you a sewer." The earthworm blushed and beamed with pride. Miss Spider clapped and cheered and cried, "Could any words be truer?" And the grasshopper, ladies and gents, in a bloom in a millions and millions of ways. You have only to ask him to give you a tune, and he plays, and he plays, and he plays. As a toy for your children, he's perfectly sweet. There's nothing so good in the shops. You've only to tickle the soles on his feet, and he hopes, and he hopes, and he hopes. He can't be very fierce," exclaimed the head of the copse. "And now, without excuse, I'd like to introduce this charming glowworm lover of simplicity. She is easy to install on your ceiling or your wall, and although they smack a bit of eccentricity, it is really rather clever, for thereafter you will never you will never, never, never have the slightest need of using electricity, at which no less than 52 policemen cried. It is true that creature all gets some fabulous publicity, and here we have Miss Spider with a mile of thread inside her, who had personally requested me to say that she is never meet Miss Muffet on her charming little tuffet. If she'd not have frightened her away. Should her looks sometimes alarm you, then I don't think it would harm you to repeat at least 100 times a day, I must never kill a spider, I must only help and guide her, and invite her in a nursery to play. The police all nodded slightly, and the firemen smiled politely, and about a dozen people cried, "Hooray!" And there's in my darling Ladybug, so beautiful, so kind, my greatest comfort since the trip began. She has 400 children, and she'd left them all behind, but they're coming on the next speech if they can. The coops cried, "She's entrancing." All the firemen started dancing. All the crowd all started cheering to a man. "And now, the silkworm," James went on, "those silk will be bare compression, will the other greatest silks they are in Rome and Philadelphia. If you would search the whole world through, from Paraguay to Timbuktu, I don't think you would find one bit of silk that could compare with it. Even the shops in Singapore don't have the stuff, and what is more, the silkworm had, I'll have you known, the honor, not so long ago, to spin and to wave and see in the press the Queen of England's wedding dress, and she's already made and sent a waistcoat for your president." "Well, good for her," the cops cried out, and all at once a mighty shout. We went up around the Empire State. Let's come down at once. Why, wait! 5 minutes later, they were all safety down, and James was excitedly telling his story to a group of flabbergasted officials. And suddenly, everyone who had come over on the beach was a hero. They were all escorted to the steps of City Hall, where the mayor of New York made a speech of welcome, and while he was doing this, 100 steeplechasers, armed with ropes and ladders and pulleys, swarmed up to the top of the Empire State Building and filled the giant pitch of the spike and lowered it into the ground. Then the mayor shouted, "We must now have a ticket day parade for our wonderful visitors." And so a procession was formed, and in the leading car, which was an enormous open limousine, St. James and all his friends. Next came the giant pitch itself. Me with cranes and hooks had quickly hoisted it onto a very large truck, and there is no set, looking just as huge and proud and brave as ever. There was, of course, a bit of the hole in the bottom of it where the spiker Empire State Building had gone it. But who cared about that, or indeed about the peach juicy that was driven out onto the street? Behind the peach, skidding about all over the place in the peach juicy, came the mayor's limousine, and behind the mayor's limousine came about 20 other limousines carrying all the important people of the city. And the crowds went wild with excitement. They lined the streets and they leaned out of the windows of the skyscrapers, cheering and yelling and screaming and clapping and throwing out bits of white paper and dick tape. And James and his friends stood up in their car and waved back and they went by. Then a rather curious thing happened. The procession was moving slowly along Fifth Avenue, then suddenly a little girl in a red dress ran out from the crowd and shouted, "Oh, James! James, could I please have just a tiny taste of your marvelous speech?" "Help yourself," James shouted back. "Eat do you want? I won't keep forever, anyway." No sooner had they said this than about 50 of their other children exploded out of the crowd and made running onto the street. "Can we have some too?" they cried. "Of course you can," James answered. "Everyone can have some." The children jumped up onto the track and swarmed like ants all over the giant peach, eating and eating to their heart's content. And as the news of that was happening spread quickly from the street to street, more and more boys and girls came running from all directions to join the feast. Soon there was a trail of children a mile long chasing after the peach as it processed slowly up Fifth Avenue. Really, it was a fantastic sight. To some people, it looked as though the Pied Piper and Hamel had suddenly descended upon New York. And to James, who had never dreamed that there could be so many children as these in the world, it was the most marvelous thing that happened ever. By the time the procession was over, the whole gigantic fruits had been completely eaten up, and only the big brown stone in the middle, licked clean and shiny by 10,000 eager little tongues, was left standing on the truck. And thus the journey ended. But the travelers lived on. Every one of them became rich and successful in the new country. The centipede was made vice president of charge of sales of a high-class firm of boot and shoe manufacturers. The earthworm, with his lovely pink skin, was employed by a company that made women's faces creams to speak commercial on television. The silkworm and Miss Spider, after they had both been taught to make nylon thread instead of silk, set up a factory together and made ropes for tightrope walkers. The glowworm became the light inside the torch of the Statue of Liberty, and thus saved a grateful city from having to pay a huge electricity bill every year. The old green grasshopper became a member of the New York Symphony Orchestra, where his playing was greatly admired. The ladybug, who had been haunted all her life by the fear that her house was on fire and her children all gone, married the head of the fire department and lived happily ever after. And as so for the enormous peach stone, it was set up permanently in a place of honor in Central Park and became a famous monument. But it was not only a famous monument, it was also a famous house. And inside the famous house there lived a famous person, James Henry Trotter himself. And all you had to do any day of the week was to go and knock upon the door, and the door would always be open to you, and you would always be asked to come inside and see the famous room where James had first met his friends. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you would find old green grasshopper in there as well, resting peacefully in a chair before the fire. Or perhaps it will be the ladybug who had dropped in for a cup of tea and a gossip of the centipede to show off the new batch of particularly elegant boots that he had just acquired. Every day of the week, hundreds and hundreds of children from far and near came pouring into the city to see the marvelous speech done in the park. And James Henry Trotter, who once, if you remember, had been the saddest and the loneliest boy that you could find, now had all the friends and playmates in the world. And because so many of them were always begging him to tell and tell again the story of his adventures on the beach, he thought it would be nice if one day he sat down and wrote it as a book. So he did, and that is what you have just finished reading.